listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Welcome to the biggest political show on the planet. More details later. What more could go wrong for Donald Trump as the coronavirus cuts a swathe through the southern red states that went for Trump last time? If Florida was a country, it would be the third most coronavirus-stricken land on the earth. And Texas and Arizona are not all that far behind them. Donald Trump, of course, at least is still putting himself out there. Joe Biden is still missing in action. What's going on in the Democratic Party? And now that Ghislaine Maxwell is safely ensconced in the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York City. She what? What? I'm sure she'll be safe. I'm sure she's going to pull through. Coronavirus isolated. What could go wrong isolated in a cell in New York City? But where are the Epstein-Maxwell tapes? That's what we'll be probing tonight with the one and only Whitney Webb. They used to say, follow the money. Surely the story now is follow the tapes. And who's on them? According to the newspapers this morning, Ghislaine Maxwell has video of two prominent US politicians having sex with minors. Well, we can guess who one of them is, I think, but who might the other one be? Intriguing. And much more than this. All coming up in the next 3 hours on the biggest political show on the planet. It's a radio show with pictures. So strap in, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London, but coming to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet and SputnikNews.com. We're on FM in crystal clarity in the Washington, D.C. area. Many listeners there now. I get mail all the time, including from inside the Congress itself. Yes, the people who I gave a whooping to back in 2005 are watching, or at least listening to this show. We're on AM right across the United States, from burning city to burning city, and of course broadcasting online all over the world on SputnikNews.com. But uniquely, more people, vastly more people, are watching this show as well as merely listening to it. Last week, after 7 straight plus 600,000 viewers, last Sunday's show obtained the staggering figure of 750,000 views. That's the second highest ever. Episode 41, you may recall, when the world looked as if it was about to go to war over Iran. 1.1 million people watched. 750,000 watched last Sunday. And if you add in the listenership on all those platforms that I mentioned, it's safe to say that the audience for the mother of all talk shows, a global university of the airwaves, was last week 1 million people plus. So if you're watching on Facebook, as most of you are, then please share now with all of your friends and contacts. You can watch on my Facebook page, which most people do, or you can watch on RT's multiple Facebook platforms. You can also watch on Twitter, you can watch on YouTube, on my own YouTube channel, or RT's multiple YouTube channels. You can watch on Instagram, and what was that other fancy new one that we were on last week? Twitch. I have no idea what Twitch is, but you can definitely watch us there also. And there will be more platforms being added over the next few weeks. We are determined to turn in 1 million audience every single week because the show deserves it and you deserve it. You deserve an open university of the airwaves where there are no tuition fees, there are no advertisements, there's no license fee, and you are positively encouraged to speak back to the teacher, as Paul did famously last week, the wee Scottish nationalist from Glasgow, I think, judging by his accent, Glasgow or environs. He's now been viewed, thanks to the Daily Express and multiple others that picked it up, by literally millions of people, demonstrating the absolute economic illiteracy of Scottish nationalism. Maybe he'll come back for more punishment this week. Please God, I hope he does. But over to the United States first. If Florida was a country, it would be behind only 3 other countries in the shocking swathe of people being cut down by the coronavirus. In fact, the epidemic is now cutting a swathe through Trump territory, and it's very likely that this is going to depress support for the president when the election comes, always assuming that he doesn't, as I predicted last week, he might cut and run before November, get himself a pardon from the new president, Mike Pence, and thus be safe from the vengeance of the Pussy Hat Brigade and the Democratic Party that will never forgive him for showing America's ugly face to the world quite as lewdly as he has. The Democratic contender has done nothing in the last week, but then he doesn't have to. He's ahead in all of the swing states that gave Trump the presidency last time, and he's fully 10 points ahead of President Trump in the general populace. If that holds up, and it's a big if, because of course Hillary Clinton was also ahead, though not quite as much as that, then it will be a landslide defeat for President Trump without Joe Biden even having to get out of bed. Not that you would know whether he was asleep or awake. He sounds just as cogent in both conditions. But it's the Ghislaine Maxwell arrest that will be the main burden of my remarks in the beginning of this show. As many of you know, I'm well familiar with the Maxwell family, including her, but especially her criminal father, Robert Maxwell, who either fell off the back of his boat, the Lady Ghislaine, clue was in the name, or was pushed off the back of his boat. My money is on the latter. And he was pushed off the back of the boat, if that's what happened, precisely because of the information which he had and which might come out wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly in the forthcoming trials, which were inevitable once Robert Maxwell was unmasked as the criminal that he was, stealing hundreds of millions of pounds from the pension funds of his own employees. And so if I'm right about that, you can imagine my consternation when I learned that Ghislaine Maxwell is now in the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York City, as safe as the Bank of England used to be. Except she's already in isolation because she may have coronavirus 19, and therefore no one can go near her. No one can interrupt her in the middle of her suicide, which probably would come as quite a big shock to her too. Because if Ghislaine Maxwell does survive to stand trial on the very serious charges warranting 30 to 40 years of imprisonment, in other words, imprisoned for the rest of her life, then the only way out of that kind of prison sentence for Ghislaine Maxwell is to cough. And cough she might. It's already being allowed to be known, let's put it that way, that she has tapes. She has tapes, she claims, of 2 prominent American politicians having sex with minors. Now, I could make a pretty good guess as to who one of those might be, but the identity of the second has got me stumped up till now. And I would very much like for her to reveal these tapes and the thousands of other tapes that we know exist, because we have eyewitness accounts that every single room in the Manhattan townhouse sold to Epstein by Mr. Wexner of Victoria's Secrets for $1, every room in that mansion was bugged. There were cameras in every room, including the bathrooms. So every act which went on in that sordid mansion is on tape. Given that, it's exceedingly unlikely that the rooms and chalets in Paedophile Island were not similarly bugged, that there were not cameras catching the guests, cavorting with whom we do not yet entirely and completely know, in the in flagrante of the allegations. Now, if those tapes exist, therefore, I want you to answer my first poll. Where are the incriminating Epstein tapes? A, Langley, Virginia, that's the headquarters of the CIA. B, Tel Aviv. And C, sleeping with the fishes. Sleeping with the fishes, I see, is ahead for the moment. So you can vote now on my Twitter feed. Now, we normally follow the money in these scandals, but I think in this case, we need to follow the tapes, because this entire Epstein episode is only explicable to me as an intelligence operation, as a means of gathering compromat, the old Russian word for compromising material, on prominent politicians, royals, British politicians and their sidekicks, American politicians, former Israeli Premier Ehud Barak, would-be politicians, would-be presidential candidates, and gathering that compromat on them so as to be able to bend them to the will of whoever is the copyright holder of that compromat in their political futures thereafter. We'll be talking to Whitney Webb, who knows more about Epstein than anyone else on the planet, perhaps as much as the woman in the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York City. And when we come to interview Whitney, do bear in mind that she was ahead of this story by many, many months, perhaps a whole year. Now everyone's talking about it, but she was brave enough, smart enough to smell this story for what it was right at the very beginning. Now, we're not just talking coronavirus, we're not just talking Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, we are talking Nicaragua. We'll be talking to a minister, no less, from Nicaragua about what's happening to his country in the 1980s. I was a frequent visitor there. All roads led to Nicaragua in the 1980s. Oxfam called it the threat of a good example, following development pathways and pathways to literacy and public health that were an absolute jewel and were a glittering attraction for other global South countries that wanted to forge their own way forward in the world. That's why they were destroyed by the United States of America at the time. That's why the Iran-Contra affair occurred. That's why these Contras, paid for by the United States, to interfere in the democratically elected government of Nicaragua's public health, education, environmental, women's rights, and other projects. And they literally cut the throats of the people who were teaching the poor peasantry how to stay healthy, how to read and write, and how to plant their crops and harvest them in the most efficacious way. And the Sandinista revolution was destroyed. But it's back. it's been re-elected to power. And guess what? Right on cue, they too have been designated as public enemies, at least number 2 after Venezuela. And a full-scale regime change operation is underway against them. We'll be talking to His Excellency, the Minister for Global Affairs in the Nicaraguan government in the course of this show. But first up is my good friend, Manila Chan. She is my host, my interlocutor every night of the week on RT America at 7 p.m. London time. And I'm very glad to say that she joins us right after the break.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the regular segment called Veterans for Peace, where we focus on the contemporary issues of war and peace that affect veterans, their families, the country, and the world as a whole. Veterans for Peace President Jerry Condon joins the show every Thursday. Hear about this and more every Thursday right here on Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
So where are the incriminating Epstein Maxwell tapes? A, Langley, Virginia, with the CIA, 22%. B, Tel Aviv, with the government of Israel and its intelligence agency, 38%. Or C, sleeping with the fishes. That's ahead at 40%, 290 votes in so far. You can vote on my Twitter feed. As I say, the great Whitney Webb is up in the course of the show talking about the Epstein affair. We'll also be talking towards the final hour to the one and only Dr. Ranjeet Brar as the coronavirus pandemic shows signs of re-rising in Britain. We'll be examining the issues of masks, the possibility of having a vaccine in place later this year. We'll be talking about the impact of this on the British economy, which has been, I think we can fairly say, catastrophic. And if not for the furlough scheme paid for by the UK taxpayer as a whole in due course, no doubt, then millions of people, many, many millions of people would be unemployed and hungry in Britain today. And indeed, they are in many other parts of the world. Manila Chan is the host of In Question every night on RT America, where I am honored to join her most nights. And I'm glad to say she joins me now. Manila, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Wonderful to see you again. Let's talk first about the coronavirus, can we? President Trump said that you had 15 cases and you'd quite soon be close to zero. He said when the weather got warm, it would simply die on its own. He said that your country was in control of it when in fact it's plain for anyone to see it is completely out of control. And now states like Florida, as I said earlier, if Florida was a country, it would be one of the most afflicted countries on the earth. How is this happening and how is it going to affect President Trump?
Well, George, first, good to see you. It's always a little strange to be on the other side of the questions. But as this would affect President Trump, I mean, first, we should address that President Trump yesterday appeared at Walter Reed Veterans Hospital just outside of D.C., finally sporting a mask. That was the first time he's ever been seen publicly wearing a mask, although people have said behind closed doors that the president has worn PPE before, but this is the first time that the press has ever captured images of that. So I think that is a big move in signaling to people that he does sort of is beginning to take this seriously, because that first wave that we saw, we were expecting a plateau and that it would flatten the curve and we would be done by Easter. Now, George, he never said which Easter. So I think that's important to clear up. And secondly, again, you're right, Florida is seeing an incredible spike there. It's obviously a very hot, humid state. We expected, or at least at the time, that medical professionals thought that as the weather warmed up, that coronavirus would dissipate with the heat. That's clearly proven not true. I think there's a lot of medical science that's not clear yet on how to address this. So I don't think it's fully, something you can pin on President Trump. And I'm not here to defend President Trump, but I will say that the U.S. has been woefully ill-prepared to deal with this, whether it was in the way of a lockdown or any type of medical procedures or processes of how to handle sick people. But the U.S. is seeing an incredible spike. We thought we plateaued, but we were wrong.
Well, you don't win the presidency if you don't win Florida. And ditto Texas, Arizona, these are all red states that he won.
Sure.
And that are now really in the pits of this pandemic. It must be hurting him.
George, those are still red states. As much as Florida might be hurting right now, it is an ardent red state. And I think a lot of people can point to New York, whose numbers still surpass Florida by hundreds of thousands, George. Florida has still not seen as many deaths as New York State has seen, which is a Democrat state. It votes Democrat. It's run by Democrats. Florida is an ardent red state. So is Texas. And Arizona could be a purple state this year. We will see. They traditionally vote Republican no matter what. It's one of the few, more Western states that do vote red. But I believe they will still go to President Trump this election cycle.
Now, it never rains, but it pours. There he was, just surviving the Mueller inquiry, just surviving the Russiagate hysteria, and along came another Russiagate. It turns out to be absolutely baseless allegation that Russia was paying a bounty to the Taliban to get them to kill American soldiers, as if they needed a bounty from anyone. And as I pointed out last week, Manila, the only people who've ever paid the Taliban bounties for killing occupiers is the United States, which paid them to kill Russians. Did this just die away like the coronavirus didn't die, or is it still a thing?
I think a lot of the left stream media is still attempting to give this thing legs, but it's not catching on the way they had hoped the first Russiagate did. People are still talking about it, but not to the extent that it blew up when it first hit the scene a few weeks ago when you and I were talking about it on In Question. It's kind of faded away, still no legs. I'm hoping it does go away, because this is bad for just global democracy. You're making a mockery of diplomacy and the real war that they should be fighting, because ISIS is still not gone. The Taliban is resurging, and I don't mean their diplomatic arm. The Taliban is resurging across Afghanistan. If the Taliban were to collect bounties for the heads of American soldiers, why then does the U.S. Congress continue to want to keep them there? Why does the DOD want to continue to keep them there? So I think a lot of the American public have learned lessons from Russiagate 1.0, where they've learned to kind of wait and listen for the facts. But meanwhile, you still have mainstream media pushing the narrative, but a lot of people aren't buying it this time.
I don't know if you know, because it's mainly a British story so far, but Christopher Steele, the author of the original Dirty Dossier, which had these poor girls wetting themselves in Moscow hotel rooms with excitement at being in the presence of Donald Trump. He's back. He's got a new dossier. This time, it alleges that half of the British establishment are secretly in the pay of China. They are Chinese agents. That's the latest of Christopher Steele's creative writing career. But moving on to the Democrats, I said earlier, and it's true, isn't it, that literally Joe Biden cannot be let out alone. We don't know if he is asleep or awake, and it would appear it makes no difference which. And yet he is still comfortably ahead in the public opinion polls. Except people say, well, wait till he has to debate with Donald Trump. And that's a fair point. But why would he have to debate with Donald Trump? Might he not just say, actually, debates in the time of the coronavirus with a debating partner who simply makes things up? I'm not going to debate him. Perhaps he'll rob us of that spectacle.
I hope he doesn't. Because obviously I work in news, and like you said, it would be a spectacle. It would make my job very interesting to sit over and monitor this debate if it were to happen in late September, which is what it's scheduled for. And that's kind of unheard of in modern American presidential elections, to not have a debate. But then again, we've never lived through a pandemic. Nobody alive today has ever lived through such a pandemic. So this is just, there's no frame of reference for it in modern history, George. And I know you've been in politics a long time. What is an election without some sort of a debate? So I guess you kind of have to presume that people have made up their minds one way or the other, whether they're voting for Joe Biden because they support him, which a lot of people don't, I should say. If he does receive the vote, a lot of it, at least from the young people, will be an anti-Trump vote, not because they truly support Joe Biden and his platforms. And I'd like to point out specifically amongst younger and older African Americans. Now, the older African American voting demographic, they actually do support him in the true sense of support. Younger African American voters, 35 and under, say they are likely to vote for him, but not because they truly support him, only because it would be an anti-Trump vote, because there's really no other alternative, unless you want to vote for Kanye West or write him in.
Well, that was my next question. Kanye West, on the face of it, is absurd, but in this election, I suppose anything can happen.
Anything goes, George.
Yeah. Is he seriously going to run? And what's the mechanics of him running? And would Kim Kardashian be a good first lady?
Well, is Melania Trump a good first lady? I mean, what are the standards we go by for first lady? I don't think we elect people based on first lady. But with Kanye West, his wife, though she supports him, she's trying to stand by her man. Ms. Kardashian is afraid that Kanye West, who suffers from bipolar depression, is currently going through a manic episode, and she thinks it'll last a few weeks. She's revealed that to the press, the Hollywood press anyway. He's escaped to Wyoming, of all places, maybe to think or to clear his head. But he has so far missed several poignant FEC filing deadline dates for several states. We have what's coming up here. We have Arkansas, California, Georgia, Illinois, Colorado, Florida, New York State. Those are coming up. And so far, the FEC says he has not filed any paperwork to run for president whatsoever. If he misses out on those states, it's something over 180 electoral votes that he'd be missing out of, that are, out of 538 that are available. So I don't know at this point that he is truly a serious candidate, so much as either this is a publicity stunt or, according to his wife, possibly a manic episode that he's suffering, which people shouldn't make fun of. People should probably use this moment, if it is a manic episode that he's experiencing in the public eye, use this as a moment to discuss mental health in this country, in your country, and how many people it really impacts across the board, and use this moment for something good rather than something divisive.
What about our own colleague, Governor Jesse Ventura? He was my great hope, but it looks like he won't be on the ballot either, doesn't it?
I haven't spoken to Jesse lately, but from what I've seen, I don't believe he has filed any FEC paperwork. I think he would have been a great candidate. He's got a great platform and a lot of supporters, because right now it's down to a two-horse race, and nobody likes that in this country. We're used to it, but nobody likes it. So far, if a third-party candidate were to appear, someone besides Howie Hawkins, who's the Green Party, and God bless him, he comes on the show. He's got a good following, but not enough to gain any primary points there to put him on the ballots anywhere, unfortunately.
And lastly, and I'm grateful for your time, Manila, what's the standing now of the Black Lives Matter protests, the anti-police moves, free zones being established in the center of Seattle and so on? Has that all just gone up like a rocket and come down like a stick, or is it still a thing?
Well, certainly BLM is a thing. The CHOP or Chaz zone have pretty much they've died. The municipality has dismantled that. The attempted CHOP zone or Chaz zone in DC, the municipality has dismantled that. As much as people wanted to say that the mayor of Washington, D.C. supports BLM by her painting Black Lives Matter down, across from 1600 Pennsylvania, that's all show. She also voted to give more money to the police, expanding different corrections policies. That's all, lipstick on a pig. So BLM is definitely a thing. Let's not take the wind out of their sails. They will definitely sway the election one way or another. Either it'll give rise to a strong third party, but somebody like Joe Biden, who is an establishment Democrat and key to the 1994 crime bill, key to mass incarceration. He was the Senate Judiciary Chair in 1994 that advocated for mass incarceration along with the Clintons. So a lot of young people know that part about history and are not thrilled about that. So the BLM group, I think we can compare to 10, 12 years ago when we saw the rise of the Tea Party movement. Once upon a time, it was a movement, and then it became a political arm. So I think we can look to see BLM become the left's version of the Tea Party and have their own platform and their own politicians who will run for office.
Manila Chan, thanks for joining us on board the Sputnik. See you next week.
You got it, George. Thank you.
Where are the incriminating Epstein tapes? A, Langley, B, Tel Aviv, or C, sleeping with the fishes? You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Let's take the first call of the evening from Federico in London. Go ahead, Federico.
Hello, George. I want to talk about the Russians paying the Taliban to kill America.
Yes.
Well, it simply doesn't make sense. The Russians actually cannot possibly benefit by helping the Taliban. I have seen a number of pieces of evidence that the Taliban are moving into Central Asian republics and causing huge amounts of trouble there. And the Russians would be insane to encourage that because they themselves had the period of war in Afghanistan, and it was really the Taliban who caused maximum amount of damage to the Afghan forces. So when you think of it, both politically, economically, from a security point of view, Russia has got no interest whatsoever helping Taliban. There are lots of other groups who Russia could help because they are more moderate and perhaps even a little bit progressive but not the Taliban. They are the absolute most fanatical of Wahhabi soldiers, Wahhabi Muslims. And so the very idea that the Americans are saying Russia is trying, to sort of help American soldiers. Russia can do that in Syria much easier without paying anybody.
Well, the head of American intelligence says the story is nonsense. The head of the American Armed Forces says the story is nonsense. The President of the United States says the story is nonsense. It's the enemies of Donald Trump that have inflated this story, but without providing a scintilla of evidence to back it up. It is, in essence, pure fake news. But it misses also the point that you just alluded to, that it is Russia that is fighting these Islamist fanatics in Syria, and the United States is on the side of the fanatics in Syria. Am I right?
That is precisely the point. And you cannot be actually fighting the same people at one corner of the world and backing them with money at the other. Maybe United States is capable of that kind of duality and insanity, but not the Russians. Russians always act with great deal of thought, and they don't
rather more caution. Yeah, rather more caution.
Stuff.
Federico, thanks very much indeed for the call. Here's the numbers: 02077 982 255 if you're calling in the UK. That's 02077 982 255. Or if you're calling from the United States, it's 001 757 744 4480. And of course, you can also tweet us, tweet me at George Galloway or at RTUK, preferably both of us. And don't forget to vote on my poll number 1. Now, every week I do a short for RT. This one has racked up record numbers too. It's on Ghislaine Maxwell. Take a look at this. The suicide of Ghislaine Maxwell in the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York City would come as a surprise to absolutely no one in the world, except perhaps Ghislaine Maxwell. The fugitive socialite has finally been bagged by the feds. It took them more than a year to do so, which is a surprise considering she was tucked away in plain sight in New Hampshire. As if on cue, her closest confidant, Laura Goldman, began popping up in the British media. Thanks to the Philadelphia Inquirer, I can reveal that this woman, who's been in every newspaper in Britain and most television stations, assuring the British that Ghislaine Maxwell will ensure that no harm comes to Prince Andrew, turns out herself to be a fugitive. The feds had to extradite her from Israel, whereafter she was convicted of extortion. So she is a proven liar, and she may be lying about Ghislaine Maxwell's friendship with her. But taking it at face value, Ghislaine Maxwell will not be spilling the beans on the rich and powerful men, some of them royals, some of them ex-presidents, some of them would-be presidents, some of them ex-prime ministers. More than one ex-prime minister appears in Jeffrey Epstein's dirty black book, and some of them on multiple occasions stayed as a guest of the convicted child sex criminal Jeffrey Epstein. And Ghislaine Maxwell is accused by literally dozens of young women, girls, even children at the time, of participating in sexual assaults and rapes against them. It doesn't get much more serious. According to Laura Goldman, it's all Epstein's fault. Most women in prison, she says, are there because of a man, laying the groundwork, no doubt, for an attempt to shift all culpability to the conveniently dead Jeffrey Epstein. But Ghislaine Maxwell will be very lucky to escape a prison sentence of 30 to 40 years, in other words, the rest of her life. And the only way to escape it is to cooperate with the law enforcement agencies, to cough, to sing like a canary to the feds. Will she do so? Well, that's what puts her life in danger. Because if she did tell all about President Clinton, about Hillary Clinton, about Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and explain why ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair and his sidekick Peter Mandelson first were attracted to the multi-millionaire rapist Jeffrey Epstein, then clearly she'd bring a lot of people down with her in exchange for a restricted sentence. That's why we're all so worried about her. I'm worried that as soon as she went into jail, we were told that she was at risk of COVID-19 and was now being isolated for a period of 14 days. Being isolated in the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York carries with it all kinds of risks and perils. So, will she sing? Will she commit suicide like her late father, the robber baron, British publisher and British MP Robert Maxwell? Or will she be pushed off the back of a boat, metaphorically speaking, as he probably was? Robert Maxwell and Ghislaine Maxwell have very close ties to the intelligence community. The Epstein affair, to me, is only explicable as an intelligence operation. The sex, sordid, disgusting, illegal as it was, is only the tip of the iceberg. The question is, who were Maxwell and Epstein working for? What have they done with the videos and recordings of these rich and powerful men, all recorded in every room in the house, including the bathroom in the townhouse in Manhattan? Where are those films now? Where are the Maxwell tapes? Where are the Epstein tapes? Never mind follow the money, though that is also interesting. Follow the tapes. If you find the tapes, you'll find the people that Ghislaine Maxwell might well be persuaded to betray in exchange for a lighter sentence. Or you might find the reason why, sadly, in a few weeks from now, Ghislaine Maxwell is no more. So, look after yourself, Ms. Maxwell. Mind how you go.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
Now, a lot of response to the opinion poll. Eric says the deep state has them and they will never see the light of day. Corruption everywhere. And by email, James says, George, I'd like to hear your views on... No, I'm not reading that one out. And Joseph says, where has all the money gone for the NHS fundraising? Only 20 million has been spent so far. Who has the rest? Additionally, what has it been spent on? I found out that Just Giving has been creaming off the money. That's not an allegation we can associate with, I should say. I've no idea of the truth of that. Nearly 400,000 from the NHS, 200,000 from the Grenfell Fund and 300,000 from the Manchester Bombing Fund. Nice when you can cash in on someone else's misery. As I say, I have no idea if those allegations are true. Renee says, Kanye West, should he really be discussed as a candidate for presidency? Well, Donald Trump is the president. Jason says, no way that Trump will be on any tape. Well, I don't think you can say that unequivocally. Why not? Is Trump as pure as the driven snow? I mean, I can think of more likely candidates, but Ghislaine Maxwell was very clear. Two prominent US politicians having sex with minors, and she's got it on tape. Lucas says, Trump is not on tape. Wishful thinking for some. Trump is bringing down the paedophile rings. Honestly, some of you live on another planet. Why do you think they fight him so much with everything they have? Because they are fighting for their lives, says Lucas loyally. James from Zimbabwe, all love, Mr. Galloway. Thank you, James. And Dex says, must say, this man talks sense. And on YouTube, Biohacker says, I will say this and say it for the last time. Biden should be in jail and locked up for the rest of his senile life. Well, the rest of his life will not be long, I suspect. He looks like a man doddering towards the exit, if I can put it that way. And so unusual attention, surely, should now be given to who he picks as the vice president, because that vice president has an extraordinarily high likelihood of automatically assuming the presidency at some stage of a Joe Biden first term. And therefore a great deal of attention and firepower will be trained upon whoever Joe Biden picks as his running mate. Once said. Now, Andy is in Washington. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Andy.
Hello, Mr. Galloway, long-time listener and first-time talker. Thank you for having me on.
Most welcome.
I agree with you with everything you're saying, and Ghislaine Maxwell. However, the reason for my calling was actually having more with your side of the pond today. I acknowledge that you've been a long time for that. I do remember in the past, I believe you've made some statements regarding Scottish independence, however, where you mentioned that you were not in favor of it at the time.
All of my life.
I was wondering...
Only all of my life.
All of your life, you were in favor of it or not in favor of it?
I have been fighting against the separatists in Scotland since I was a teenager, since I was 15 years old.
But I was wondering if you don't see some parallels between the advocacy for Palestinian independence and perhaps the advocacy for Scottish independence from Westminster, because there's a lot of corruption that's taking advantage of Scotland.
Well, it's a quite extraordinary comparison, even coming from Washington. The Palestinian people are occupied militarily. They have no vote. They have no rights. They are gunned down. They are tortured. They are kept in prison for obtains in Scotland. Scotland has every democratic right to leave Britain anytime. It's been trying to do so of the SNP, but the Scottish people keep frustrating them, because the Scottish people don't want to break up this small country of ours. And now the Palestinian people have no right of self-determination. The Scottish people have every right of self-determination and exercised it in a once-in-a-lifetime, or at least once-in-a-generation, referendum just 6 years ago, and decisively voted to remain in Britain. So I'm not sure what comparison you have managed to discern, but please tell me.
Well, a lot of the Better Together promises were false, and I do agree, of course, that the Palestinian situation is much more perilous. I mean, as far as humanitarian concerns, of course, there is no comparison, but I still see false promises, the Better Together banner, and then you don't deliver anything what they promise.
I have no idea what false promises you're talking about, but to compare people who are literally shot in the head for raising their flag, people who have never been allowed in more than 50 years to cast a single vote, to affect the way in which they are governed and occupied. To make that comparison with what you call false promises is frankly obscene, Andy. Well, we've lost Andy. Let's go to Eves in Idaho. Go ahead, Eves.
Hello, George. I wanted to go back on a short that you did on Venezuela 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Okay, because I think that I think that you proved, but you didn't maybe articulate it the way I'm going to articulate it. You proved that government cannot, it's not their job to recognize country. You proved it. Because your proof goes as follows. You say, let's suppose that government recognize other governments and not the United Nations. Then any government who has assets of the other government in his country can just say that he's going to give this asset to a friend, you see?
Yes.
And so it is an absurdity, you see? So your show, what I wanted to say is that your short proves that it is only the job of the United Nations to determine who is the government of a country. It cannot be other governments. Otherwise, it's dysfunctional.
Yeah, it's... Or I think you're old enough as... Continued... Cambodia. After the revelation about the attempted genocide in then Kampuchea, now Cambodia. We did so despite the fact that Pol Pot territory, but for Cold War reasons, continued to recognize one of the greatest mass murderers in the history of human affairs. So we have been here before, Eve.
Yes, that's true. But you see, my point is that there is here a question of, if you listen to our Secretary of State, he tells you because, he wants to tell you about the Venezuelan constitution and all that. But there is a mathematical argument that it cannot work this way. It would be dysfunctional. Every country would find somebody, to give the assets that they hold to this person. I mean, it's an absurdity. And also, if you let me, can I make a remark on Afghanistan? Hello?
Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Radio Sputnik, we speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Well, just as I told you how many people were watching and listening, we're getting that familiar gremlin feeling. And apparently once or twice, maybe more, my sound was interfered with and cut short. My apologies for that. But the show goes on, 02077 982 255, and the US number 001 757 744 4480. You can tweet me at George Galloway, at RTUK News. Let's go to the news just a few minutes early so we can see if we can sort this problem out. The news with Jamie Lowe.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
At least 33 US states have now experienced an increase in new coronavirus cases compared to last week. A total of 61,352 new cases were recorded and 685 new virus-related deaths. A total of 3,245,925 cases of coronavirus have been recorded in the United States by the end of the day on Saturday, according to Johns Hopkins University. Since the pandemic began, at least 134,000 feared wearing a mask would make him look weak and that it would shift the focus away from the economic recovery. He has also retweeted messages making fun of his Democratic presidential rival, Joe Biden, for wearing a face mask. A COVID-19 vaccine could be rolled out across the country in the first half of next year if trials are successful, according to a leading UK scientist. Professor Robin Shattock, who heads a team developing a coronavirus vaccine at Imperial College London, has said enough doses would be available for everyone in Britain if trials go really well. Speaking today, he said, "We anticipate, if everything goes really well, we'll get an answer as to whether it works by early next year." So far, 15 volunteers have been vaccinated, but Professor Shattock says this will be ramped up in the coming weeks to include another 200 to 300 patients. But he warned that there was no certainty that any of the vaccines currently being developed would work. Walt Disney World Resort has begun to reopen in Florida despite a coronavirus surge across the US state. The site's Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom opened on Saturday. Epcot and Disney's Hollywood Studios are expected to follow from the 15th of July. Visitors will be required to wear face masks and adhere to other safety measures across the complex in Orlando. More than 250,000 cases of COVID-19 have been reported in Florida, along with 4,197 deaths. Disney first closed the resort in March during the early months of America's outbreak, while infections were largely concentrated in New York and California at first. Florida is amongst several states recording a rise in coronavirus cases in recent weeks. In Orange County, where the resort is based, authorities have reported 16,630 cases, some of the highest numbers in Florida. Some of its competitors, Universal Orlando and SeaWorld Orlando, reopened to visitors several weeks ago. The former US Special Counsel Robert Mueller, in a very rare move, has defended his office's prosecution of Trump advisor Roger Stone, saying he is still a convicted felon, and rightly so, in light of the president's commutation of Stone's jail sentence. He said he lied about the identity of his intermediary to WikiLeaks. He lied about the existence of written communications with his intermediary. He lied by denying he had communicated with the Trump campaign about the timing of WikiLeaks releases. He, in fact, updated senior campaign officials repeatedly about WikiLeaks, and he tampered with a witness, imploring him to stonewall Congress. He added, because his sentence has been commuted, he will not go to prison, but his conviction stands. Trump on Friday commuted the prison sentence of his longtime friend. The announcement came just days before Stone was set to report to a federal prison in Georgia. Poles are voting in a presidential election seen as the battle for the country's future and its strained relations with the European Union. The second round pits incumbent Andrzej Duda, an ally of the Conservative government, against socially liberal Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski. A Duda win would herald controversial changes to the judiciary and continued opposition to abortion and gay rights. Trzaskowski backs a more progressive agenda and an active role in the EU. Duda toppled the first round of voting with a convincing lead, but fell short of the 50% needed to win outright. But Trzaskowski expects to win the support of most of those who voted for other candidates, and a close result is predicted. And finally, a nude painting by Sanyu, who's been hailed as the Chinese Matisse, has sold for over 258 million Hong Kong dollars. That's more than 20 million pounds. It sold for that incredible price at auction last week, confirming his status as one of the most sought-after names in the lucrative Asian art market. Painted in the 1950s, Cotonou features 4 reclining female figures in the French-Chinese painter's distinctively saturated style. The artwork led Sotheby's first major sale in Hong Kong since the coronavirus disrupted its live auction schedule, becoming the evening's most expensive lot after a 10-minute bidding war between 4 collectors. It's just the latest astronomical price paid for a work by Sanyu, who went largely unrecognised during his lifetime and was effectively destitute upon his death in Paris in 1966. Skyrocketing prices reflect a surge in interest from Asian collectors, whose spending power now significantly shapes the global auction market. Between the year 2000 and 2019, the price of Sanyu's work jumped by more than 1,000%. According to experts, his brushstrokes and a sense of proportion are truly Matissean. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Coming up in the next few minutes, Whitney Webb, the famous investigative journalist who broke the story of Epstein and has been ahead of the pack throughout. She's joining us in the next few minutes, as I say. The poll is running. Where are the incriminating Epstein tapes? A, Langley, Virginia. B, Tel Aviv. C, sleeping with the fishes. You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Now, Sid says, I grew up in the same area as George Galloway in Dundee, but what I can't understand is, where did he get that weird accent? A lot of people like my accent. I get paid to speak on television and radio, Sid. I don't know about you. And I did leave Dundee 40 years ago, so perhaps it's not quite as acute as yours probably is, but a planing and an ingin and an ah, if you don't mind. And on Facebook, Kayuta says, I enjoy the show. Sani from Nigeria. And Kalim says, watching from Karachi in Pakistan. And Paul says, watching from Madeira in Portugal. Aaron says, Homer Simpson would make a good president. It would be nice to see a bald man president. Gerald Ford was bald, and so was President Eisenhower. But you're right, it's been a while since someone who didn't have good hair was the president. And Spring says Maxwell may end up like Epstein. Whatever happened to her, wait until she's released all the evidence that is involved. Now, as I say, the great Whitney Webb, the famous investigative journalist, was ahead of the pack on the Epstein story. Let's see what she makes of it now. Whitney Webb, thank you very much indeed for joining us again. When we first talked about this, it was a somewhat obscure story, but it's now the biggest story in the world. How did we get here, and what are we still missing?
Well, there's definitely a lot we're still missing, despite the fact that this has gotten a lot of media attention. What has consistently been overlooked by the media are the ties of this entire operation by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to intelligence, and that this was largely sponsored by Israeli military intelligence, but also with the complicity of U.S. intelligence. And this has consistently been overlooked because, digging into that fact exposes that this was state-sponsored, and that accountability, in order for real accountability to happen, there has to be accountability for those state sponsors, not just the public faces, or what are now the public faces of this sexual blackmail operation, which was first Jeffrey Epstein and now is Ghislaine Maxwell.
Well, I concur with that. Indeed, I said as much, though not as well, in my introduction. This whole Epstein affair is only explicable as an intelligence operation. The fact that some of the most prominent individuals associated with Epstein continued to associate with him even after his conviction more than a decade ago. Even a member of the British royal family continued to rub shoulders, at least shoulders, with him despite that criminal conviction. And the leniency that was applied upon his conviction, the unwillingness to prosecute him for all the crimes on which the police had evidence at the time, the sheer scale of the funding of Epstein, who had no visible means of generating the hundreds of millions of dollars that he was able to deploy and spend and use to corrupt others. And the fact that all these big politicians were around him like flies around you-know-what, all seems to indicate that they were compromised by him and Ghislaine Maxwell. Isn't that right?
Yes, I would certainly agree with that to an extent, but they could also have been part of numerous other connections and spheres of involvement of Epstein. For example, Epstein was not just involved in the sexual blackmail operation. He was involved in a lot of financial crimes, first through his main banking vehicle, Bear Stearns, which later became, JP Morgan after Bear Stearns collapsed in 2008. And of course, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, through her father, for example, had connections to people that had previously been involved in Iran-Contra, who of course were again prominent in the George W. Bush White House. And so, and also had ties to, of course, the Clintons and people in those spheres as well. So of course, it's essentially a swamp. So some of them may have been directly compromised by the sexual blackmail operation, while others may have, been associated with that sort of criminal nexus, I guess you could say, but not necessarily compromised, but certainly aware of what was going on, because we have reports from his, in the 90s, talking about Epstein being CIA and Mossad linked. Back in 1992, the first article about him and his association with Ghislaine Maxwell that surfaced in the British press. Then we have another article that was in the Evening Standard, I believe, in 2003, talking about how Ghislaine Maxwell was known to have parties where she would host young girls and brandish whips and train them in sexual techniques to please older men. So this is something that was known well before Epstein's arrest by the people in these elite circles, both socially and politically elite circles, and they were complicit in this the entire time. They didn't necessarily have to be compromised by that, but by after the year 2000, this was well known to have been going on.
Now, it turns out that she was tucked away in a cottage called Tucked Away in New Hampshire all of this time. It's inconceivable that the FBI didn't know that, isn't it? And if they did know it, why have they waited all this time even to formally question her?
Well, what's interesting is that she was first reported to have been in that area back in August of last year, staying at the home of her alleged boyfriend, Scott Borgeson, who has ties to Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. And immediately after that had been reported and appeared to have been reported as credible, there was this photo that came out showing Ghislaine being in Los Angeles at an In-N-Out Burger that was later shown to be a photoshopped forgery, essentially, making people think that, in fact, she was not on the East Coast, but the West Coast. And then a few days later, Ghislaine Maxwell, Ghislaine's older sister, is photographed just miles from this mansion where she and her boyfriend were allegedly staying, loading up multiple bags, numerous suitcases into an SUV, and declined to comment. Ghislaine Maxwell later claimed that she was staying at a hotel nearby for a few days, but it's kind of odd why she would need 8 suitcases or so for a trip to Massachusetts that lasted only 2 to 3 days. Right. So there's definitely some odd things that have been going on there. Since August of last year, she was also allowed to buy a home, the home that she was arrested in, this tucked away mansion. She purchased it 7 months ago, allegedly under a name that the FBI couldn't identify her as being Ghislaine Maxwell, but the name she used was G Max, which is hardly well hidden, I guess you could say.
Sherlock Holmes would have worked that one out.
Right, especially, consider all of the sprawling surveillance system of U.S. intelligence and, domestic intelligence like the FBI, and claims that they're unable to track this woman, when they allegedly, have used, after 9/11, the need to track and surveil to increase their budgets and their, surveillance capabilities, and they're allegedly unable to keep track of this woman. I really don't buy it. The fact that she wasn't arrested for, over a year, I also think is really telling, as is the fact that this indictment that she is now facing admits that she was involved in the sexual assault of these minors, but she is not charged for that. What she is charged for is enticing them to cross state lines to participate in those illegal sex acts, but she is not charged for participating in those illegal sex acts that she brought those minors to, along with Jeffrey Epstein, which I think is incredibly scandalous, and also shows the fact that I think they're going to attempt to try and let her off relatively leniently, allow her to strike a deal that she will give information to them or these alleged tapes that she has to U.S. intelligence or to the FBI in exchange for leniency or something of the sort. We already have her lawyers requesting bail, $5 million bail, and claiming that she won't be a flight risk because under the conditions of bail, they propose that she'll be GPS monitored and unable to travel and things like that. And given the leniency of the charges that she is facing, it's actually quite possible that could happen. Though if they wish to, if there is an effort by, the Bill Barr Department of Justice to sort of take her out of the picture, as was done with Jeffrey Epstein last year, I mean, that is also a possibility. It all hinges on what happens in 2 days' time on July 14th at the next hearing in the Ghislaine Maxwell case.
Well, she's clearly using the existence of this compromat material. In the British press today, it is claimed on her behalf that she has 2 tapes of 2 prominent US politicians having sex with minors. I think we can take a guess at who she wants us to think those 2 prominent US politicians are. But this could just be moonshine, couldn't it? It could be just the chaff that's thrown up. Because after all, if your thesis and my thesis is correct, then the authorities already know who did what to whom and where.
Correct. No, I think that's absolutely true. Like I said, Israeli and U.S. intelligence have had access, at least elements of those intelligence apparati, have had access to the names of the people involved. I mean, a lot of the names involved, people in the public know, right? So why wouldn't the FBI and the CIA and their counterparts in Israel, right, also know that? So I think it's sort of a political move. It could potentially this, claim that there's these two unnamed politicians who could be exposed as pedophiles, for example, and have their careers ended, is coming at a very interesting time, in U.S. politics, in an election year, just months away from an election, right? That could have major ramifications for either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So, of course, it's definitely very interesting to consider the timing of all of this as well. But it's definitely, I think, let's consider, too, that Ghislaine Maxwell is a fundamentally untrustworthy person, as is most of her family, particularly, having learned these behaviors from her father, to whom she was extremely close, right? So, Ghislaine Maxwell's interest right now is self-preservation, preserving herself, but it's also very possible that some of the intelligence sponsors of the sexual blackmail operation want these two particular politicians to do something they're not currently doing and are exerting this as pressure for some, currently unknown purpose, but, it remains to be seen.
What can you tell us about this woman, Laura Goldman, who popped up last week in literally every single British newspaper and on two flagship British television shows, claiming to be a close confidant of Ghislaine Maxwell? As I pointed out just half an hour ago, it turns out she herself had to be extradited by the United States from Israel to face extortion charges on which she was convicted. But she was presented to the British public in this so-called mainstream media as a bona fide chum of Ghislaine Maxwell, assuring the British people that Miss Maxwell would never allow any harm to come to our own Prince Andrew.
Well, I haven't followed Laura Goldman specifically, but it has been kind of frequent over the past year or so to have these sort of stories pop up especially in tabloid media, claiming that this person or that person has alleged knowledge of where Ghislaine Maxwell is or certain things that she was doing, and later it turns out to be false. This appears to be just another incident related to that, attempting to capitalize on top of the media frenzy around it. But also, it could have been intentional in the sense that, her coming out, this Laura Goldman woman being so heavily promoted, and what she's saying, of course, distracts from other aspects of the case that are, accurate, can be confirmed, and are fundamentally more important, right? So, and this has happened on numerous occasions, trying to keep the focus of the Epstein case on certain focal points that are part of the case, but not necessarily important to getting at the heart of the matter, right? So I think this is just another example of that playing out and sort of distracting from, the extent of Ghislaine Maxwell's crimes and the entire operation. I mean, media in general have been portraying her using terms like socialite, philanthropist, things like this to describe a woman who was directly involved in orchestrating one of the largest sexual blackmail and sex trafficking of minor operations in the world. It was a global operation on behalf of intelligence agencies, and who herself has partaken in the sexual assault and rape of minors. And the fact that, this is the type of media attention this woman is receiving, I think is, a scandal in and of itself.
Well, it's certainly true that not many celebrities were celebrating her final arrest. And one actually said, who hasn't been photographed with Ghislaine Maxwell? Well, me for one.
Right.
The normalization, if you like, of Ghislaine Maxwell is further added to by Goldman's claim that most women in prison are there because of a man. They're going to try and portray her as someone who was merely love-struck. It was nothing to do with these hundreds of millions and nothing to do with the intelligence operation. It was just that she was following her man. Do you expect that to be a runner in the U.S. courts?
Well, I think the U.S. court system may actually use as an excuse to give her this leniency that her lawyers are arguing for. And let's keep in mind that Ghislaine Maxwell is being represented by a former assistant attorney of the same office that is currently prosecuting her and has direct ties to that, and was actually opposed to the recent firing of the the Manhattan District Attorney Jeffrey Berman, which was actually done by Bill Barr, and people had assumed that Bill Barr had removed him in order to complicate the arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell in some way. But why is her defense attorney arguing against that? Bill Barr, of course, has his own conflicts of interest with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal with his father, who used to work for U.S. intelligence, having hired Jeffrey Epstein back in the 70s, right? So there is a lot of oddities about the court case in general, but I think that this whole thing, this whole narrative is being one mostly for the public to try and set up some sort of leniency or deal making between Ghislaine Maxwell and prosecutors that will see her be allowed to post bail, which I think is unfortunate, but it seems to be the direction things are pointing at this point in time.
That would seem to indicate that you think her life is safe, that she's not going to suffer the same suicide that Epstein himself did.
If she posts bail, then yes. But if she is not allowed to post bail, then I think it will be a repeat of exactly what happened with Epstein. And they've also set up that narrative to an extent, too. So it all, like I said, hinges on the decision that is made on this July 14th hearing.
And finally, and I'm grateful for your time, if politicians were compromised by an intelligence agency or agencies filming them committing serious sexual offenses, not just career-ending activity, but likely to lead to their imprisonment. It's hard to imagine a more powerful hold over politicians than that. I wonder what political decisions, stances, attitudes are directly attributable to the existence of such compromat.
Well, one clue towards that is we can look at the types of U.S. politicians and their involvement, and what they've been involved in, the politicians that have sort of been publicly roped into this thing. A lot of them were figures during the Clinton administration, Bill Richardson, Clinton himself, and also George Mitchell, and a lot of those, a lot of them were involved in negotiations with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East specifically. It's also worth pointing out that Ghislaine Maxwell's nephew was appointed to a post in the Hillary Clinton State Department, where he was actually in charge of the State Department's policy regarding Middle Eastern affairs, right? So there has been this odd link between, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and the Maxwells and that particular aspect of U.S. foreign policy over the years.
Can you run that one past me again? The nephew of Ghislaine Maxwell was in charge of the Middle East desk in Hillary Clinton's State Department?
That's correct. Yes. He is the son of Isabel Maxwell, who was actually deeply tied to numerous, I guess you could say, heavy hitters in Israeli politics, the son of Itzhak Shamir, Yair Shamir. She gave a personal tour of to Shimon Peres of the United States. She was involved in Israeli technology firms, many of them with close ties to Israel's military intelligence apparatus, and of course her sister Ghislaine as well. And her son was appointed, Alex, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his last name, but it was the son with her first husband, who was also a Clinton donor, was appointed to this role in the State Department while Hillary Clinton had ties to Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein themselves. Jeffrey Epstein was involved in the Clinton Foundation, and Ghislaine Maxwell was involved in the Clinton Global Initiative, was also a guest at Chelsea Clinton's wedding.
Yeah, in the front row, I seem to recall. What a tangled web, and we're very lucky that we have Whitney Webb to untangle it. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again on the mother of all talk shows. So where are the incriminating Epstein tapes? The poll: A, Langley, 22%, B, Tel Aviv, 44%, C, sleeping with the fishes, 34%. Let us know what you think. You've still got more than half an hour to vote on that. Renee says, did Epstein really die? Was there evidence of his suicide? And Jeff says by email, I'm increasingly annoyed and angry at you, trying to blame all the world's problems on capitalism. Moi? When in actual fact, socialism is an ideology that has resulted in more slavery in the history of human than any other political ideology ever created. Jeff, give me a call, will you? I'd like to debate that one with you. 02077 982 255. Or if you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Or if you're in Broadmoor and it's too late to call, call next week. Tony says, why are the UK and the US in total political chaos? Both countries appear ungovernable these days. And Gary says, did you see the way Marc Francois MP very smugly threatened the head of the British Army last week? I didn't actually, Gary, but I can quite imagine it. Marc Francois appears to me like Captain Mannering of the Home Guard on the BBC show. Now, let me see. Yes, it's this week. This is the spot where I look at the momentous events, for good or ill, in this week in history that shaped what we are today. It was actually on this day that the Rolling Stones gave their first performance in the Marquee Club in London in 1962. My goodness, what a career that has been. 12 years later, on the same day, one of the greatest managers in football history, Bill Shankly, retired from Liverpool FC. It was premature. He was only 60, and he would regret it until his death. And in 1998, on this day, Zinedine Zidane scored twice as France won its first World Cup, beating Brazil 3-0. A day later, on July the 13th, in 1923, the Hollywood sign was officially dedicated in the hills above Hollywood, Los Angeles. It originally read Hollywoodland, but the 4 last letters were dropped after renovation in 1949. That was a very smart move. And in 1943, the greatest tank battle in history ended with Russia defeating Germany at Kursk. Almost 6,000 tanks took part, and almost 3,000 were lost by Germany. On July 14th, in 1789, the French Revolution began with the fall of the Bastille prison. Bastille Day is a public holiday in France to this day. In 1933, all non-Nazi parties were banned in Germany. And in 1958, a group of Iraqi army officers staged a coup in Iraq, which overthrew the monarch, King Faisal. He was killed and his prime minister dragged through the streets by a car, I think, by rope. Iraq's coup leader and Prime Minister Abdul Karim al-Qasem was later himself ousted and killed in 1963 in a coup led by the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. It's Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, actually, what comes round. A day later, on July 15th, 1995, thousands of Muslim refugees fled the captured so-called safe area of Srebrenica, forced out by the Bosnian Serbs. United Nations officials described it as the biggest ethnic cleansing operation in Europe since World War II. Some 40,000 women, children, and elderly people were ordered to leave where they had been under the protection of Dutch peacekeepers. What was not known then is that between 7,000 and 8,000 Muslim men were subsequently killed by Serb soldiers in the days following the fall of Srebrenica. On July 16th, in 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered preparations for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. And you see in my counterfactual novel, it's called Queensway, it deals with what might have happened if that Operation Sea Lion had been a success. But 5 years later, to the day, Winston Churchill, Harry S. Truman, and Joseph Stalin gathered at Potsdam to discuss the fate of a defeated Germany. In 1936, on July 17th, Spanish generals Francisco Franco and Emilio Mola led a right-wing uprising beginning the Spanish Civil War. And in 1979, the left-wing Sandinistas took control of Nicaragua after 46 years of dictatorial rule by the Somoza family. An American president once said that Somoza might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And there's more on Nicaragua later. On July 18th in 1925, Adolf Hitler, him again, published Mein Kampf. The original title was the catchy 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. And in 2003, a body believed to be that of the British government scientist, Dr. David Kelly, was found in Woodland, not far from his Oxfordshire home. I'm making a film about this and the murky doings which surround it, which I hope will be aired shortly, unless anything happens to me. And if it does, I did not go into those woods voluntarily. And that's it. That was the week that was. Let's go to North Carolina. Why wouldn't we? And hear from Mark. Go ahead, Mark. Hello, Mark.
Hey, how you doing there, George?
Yeah, good.
Hey,
nice
George.
to hear from you. Go ahead.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I just want to go into Epstein a little bit. All right. I called you. I don't know, about a couple of months ago or so, about that I used at one time I was a correctional officer in Texas.
Yeah.
And I've done my share of suicide watches and all that. And there's no way I believe that Epstein killed himself at that point, or I believe the government story about the two sleeping officers. If they were asleep, they were drugged. And then they either killed Epstein at that point or they smuggled them out, probably to Israel. All right? I'm not sure. But look, George, this government, both my government here in the United States and your government here in Britain are evil. Plain and simple. I'm sorry. I got no use for most of them. There are a few good people in there, but for the most part, they're stark raving evil, both the Republican and the Democratic Party, and from what I can tell, with you guys, with the Tories and the Labor Party. They do not serve the people. We cannot trust them. I don't trust them. I trust them as far as I can throw them, and that's not very far. I think they need to be replaced. They need to be replaced quickly. Nobody in their right mind can believe that they're really doing everything they can to protect this witch right now from killing herself or somebody killing her. If they did what was right, she wouldn't even be in that jail. She would either be in military custody in a very strict military post. Probably the best post would be a Marine brig, or she would be in the custody of U.S. Marshals. The Witness Protection Program, they're also capable of guarding prisoners, okay? And she would be hidden somewhere, and they'd be using trusted deputy marshals, okay? They would not be doing this, George. Okay, this is a setup. She knows enough to bring down the entire United States and probably the British government. And you know who she's working for? She's working in Mossad. Everything going on in our foreign policy, everything, especially favoring Israel, and even I believe a lot of the anti-Russian nonsense is due to blackmailed politicians, okay? Everything. The hatred of Putin, the Syrian situation, trying to constantly overthrow Assad, what happened in Libya, this is all due to blackmailed politicians in this country, and it goes very deep.
Actually, Russia has, paradoxically, very good relations with Israel. And Putin with Netanyahu.
Yeah, but they don't
Netanyahu frequently pops up in Moscow. So we shouldn't be too formulaic about these things. It's much more complicated than that, Mark.
Yeah, but the thing is, Putin doesn't march to Netanyahu's orders either, okay?
No, he doesn't, no.
He's not recognizing the stolen heights as belong to Israel. He's not basically encouraging Israel to take over the rest of Palestine.
No, to the contrary. That's why I say paradox. It's a paradox. That's why I say it's a paradox. The Soviet Union recognized Israel
I think what it is
before the United States did. Countries like Czechoslovakia, then in the Soviet orbit, armed the Haganah, the nascent Israeli armed forces. A huge number of Russian citizens live in Israel. Many are dual citizens. And notwithstanding the points you make, which are accurate, the policy of the Russian government towards the Israel-Palestine question is much more balanced than other governments are. But on a personal level, or if you like, on a, I don't know what you'd say, on a deep level, relations between Russia and Israel are quite close.
Well, they are, but at the same time, Israel knows they can only cross a certain line with Russia, okay? And they're not going to get them to... One thing I noticed about Putin, he tries to be like a referee or like a lion tamer, surrounded by man-eating lions, and tries to keep things that way. And that's why he has friendships, or at least relations with Erdogan, his relationship with Netanyahu, some of the worst butchers in the world today. Yet he tries to have relationships with other countries too. He's got a great relationship with Assad. He's got a great relationship with Iran. Okay, so he's like a lion tamer, basically. I think.
Well, I think that is a very clever. That is a very clever metaphor. Someone should animate it or make it into a cartoon. I'm sure he would like that. Thanks very much indeed, Mark, for that call. Tom is in Daventry on the FBI and Ghislaine Maxwell. Go ahead, Tom.
Hello, George. Just a bit of wishful thinking, really. It would just be nice if Ghislaine Maxwell would think to herself, well, actually, whatever happens, I'm dead, so I'm going to bring a few down with me. That would be nice. But the reality of the situation is, well, my question is, if the FBI have information that could incriminate global politicians, that information is a currency, it's valuable. So does it mean then that we will actually never hear about that?
Well, I thought Whitney's answer to me on that was very telling. The two prominent US politicians that Ghislaine Maxwell says she has tapes of them committing rape against children, couldn't get more serious than that. That has perhaps been released in order to get those two US politicians to do something they haven't yet done, or to stop doing something they are doing, to bend them, in other words, to the deep state's will. What do you think of that?
Yeah, you're probably right. You obviously know a lot more about it than I do, but I don't know. I think with the agencies that are involved in this, you just think that the idea of keeping that information mostly, or the most damaging parts of it, to themselves, so they can then still use it in the future, might be possible.
Yes, although if the thesis of Whitney and myself is correct, then the intelligence services have had the films all along, because the films were being made on their behalf. And the politicians thus entrapped were forever compromised and would do whatever they were asked. Imagine if you were a politician and somebody actually had a film of you committing such a heinous, a repulsive, hellish act. Then rather than see that released, you wouldn't say no to anything, would you?
No, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, it will be very interesting to see how this plays out.
She's in a powerful position, but she's also in a very vulnerable position. If the feds are going to send her to prison for decades, then why wouldn't she use what she has? On the other hand, if they think that she might use it, then someone might kill her.
So it all kind of points to the fact that she's going to be ending up like her boyfriend then?
Well, not necessarily. She might do a deal. She might get probation. She might get sent out cleaning the streets of Florida or somewhere, I don't know, in an orange jumpsuit. They may cut a deal with her that is sufficiently advantageous that they can guarantee her silence forever. But if that's not true, then all hell will be let loose. Thanks very much for that, Tom. Let's take a 60-second break, shall we?
Radio Sputnik.
Hello, Future Express Woking. What is it you want? Oh, you want an ill-advised interview on the BBC? A cheese pizza, extra immature, and a raw bailout. No, we don't take taxpayers' money. Yeah, but we do take contactless. Would you like a receipt for that, Mr. Prince?
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Keel on Facebook says the FBI can track Black Lives Matter protesters, but they can't track Maxwell. And Andy says the Royals and the Clintons are untouchable. That's Andy of Windsor. I'm not sure if there's any relation. And on YouTube, Tony says, where did George get that hat? In Lisbon, actually. Timothy says, Whitney Webb is one of the best reporters there is. Thanks, George. And Renv says, if she has got tapes of underage sex, she should have handed them over without being forced to. What kind of creature is she? Well, the scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. And the same Renv says, Ghislaine is innocent. Please free her and stop saying nasty things. Love. From Jimmy Saville. And Dirry says, whatever happened to David Icke? Is he okay? He's never been okay since he played in goal for, was it Southampton or Leicester? I can't remember. Bob says, Ghislaine is a mega pimp for the elite. And on Twitter, Dr. Fath says, great show, Georgie boy, but must disagree regarding bald presidents. Haven't we got one now? What an intriguing thought, Doctor. How cynical. And Fra says they will ring Maxwell out to get all the tapes and photos, and once they are convinced she has given everything up, then they will kill her. Okay, the numbers, 02077 982 255. And if you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Or tweet me at George Galloway, at RT UK News. And the poll is a bit slow, actually, 584 votes so far, but Tel Aviv is heavily in the lead. It's up 2% on 44. Langley, I'm surprised, is way down at 22. That's what I'd be voting for, actually. Sleeping with the Fishes, 34% down 1. I would say not, because they're too valuable to be allowed to be sleeping with the fishes. And if they're sleeping with the fishes, somebody might fish them out. So you can call now. There are some lines free if you want to get on the show after 9 p.m. You've got the numbers. Now, Dr. Paul Oquist is the Minister for National Policies of the Presidency of the Republic of Nicaragua. And it's 41 years, exactly as I said, of Nicaragua's revolution, which started on the 19th of July, 1979. It was a remarkable revolution. I remember how exhilarating it was. The proximate or starting shot was the taking of the puppet parliament of the Somoza dictatorship by a group of Sandinista guerrillas, fighters. I think the leader was Comandante Zero. They took control of the parliament, and then thereafter they swept to power. And when they got there, they so transformed Nicaragua from the feudal backwater that it was, with virtually no one able to read or write, with the life expectancy of the ordinary peasant in the fields in Nicaragua absurdly, ridiculously short, and ill health and general levels of poverty that were an absolute disgrace in 1979. And the transformation of Nicaragua was such that it became almost a poster child for people who wanted to encourage countries to follow the path of independent development. And it was such a success story that the United States had to destroy it. And I was there going back and forward. I was there many times, a dozen times or more, and I saw the transformation which the revolution brought about, and I also saw the horror, the evil of the counter-revolution, the contra-revolution that the United States paid for. Now, Dr. Paul Oquist is coming up in just a moment, but let's take some calls. David is in Alaska. Go ahead, David.
Good morning, George, and here for the socialist countries of Latin America that have sustained themselves and so far prevailed against such horrible odds.
So far, David, so far.
Right, I take that into account. I'm nearly 70, and I've watched it all happen in the course of my lifetime. But the focus of my call is regarding Russia and supposed bounty gate, and how so consistently the Russians have used peaceful means to circle around and avoid outright warfare with the United States or anybody else as a matter of principle, as a matter of seasoned diplomacy. I mean, they're so good at what they do, and yet the U.S. continues with its bullying, assertive ways. And it goes so much against the grain of Russian diplomacy and their position in the world with a belligerent U.S. to do something so fickle and so mean-spirited as this bounty business. It's inconsistent with their foreign policy and the diplomats they put upon the world stage. And one other thing is to remember that this is part of the great game as articulated by Alfred Mackinder back in 1906, and maintaining a world island for trade and domination of imperialism around the Russian state, China, and everybody else. I sent you a few emails to document some of this stuff, but they are playing the long game, and this is just one more incident of a false flag to inflame the public.
Well, I couldn't put it better, David. That's the call of the night so far. Thanks very much for making it. Let's go from Alaska to Miami. Why wouldn't you? Jonell is in Miami and wants to talk about Epstein. Go ahead, Jonell.
Good evening. Good afternoon, George. I've watched a couple of your documentaries on the Jewish state and anti-Semitism. I guess they would put it as anti-Semitism, but you're not anti-Semitic at all.
Not
and
remotely, no.
I feel like, exactly, I feel like what's going on with Epstein is out of control. It shows that our governments have such a hold over the people that we refuse to believe in the reality that's going on. I was a former inmate, did around 7 years of my life for being incarcerated for a crime that I did. And I went on what's called suicide watch, what Jeffrey Epstein would have been on, supposedly. And when you're on suicide watch in any state facility, and I'm sure that in a maximum security federal facility that the rules are much more tended to because federal facilities are paid more and get much more funding. But in a state facility alone, I know that you have a guard in front of your door and cameras all around your cell. So to believe that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide without anybody knowing what happened, and the body was able to get out of there in a van, no one was able to identify the body, is beyond belief to me, and I can't go for it. But like I said, it just goes to show the reality that our governments have given us, and that we say, okay, if the news tells us, if they tell us what happened, that's what happened.
Well, of course, he wasn't just in a maximum security facility. He was about to face the trial of the 21st century. This was the highest value, most controversial prisoner in the United States of America. And we're asked to believe not only that the security cameras failed, but that not one but both of the guards that were supposedly watching the feed of the security cameras, both were asleep on the job. And we're asked to believe that with paper sheets, Epstein successfully committed suicide. Now, I have seen an interview with the world-leading expert on the bones around the neck and throat, and he concluded that the force required to break the bone in the throat that Epstein suffered could not possibly be done by hanging by a paper sheet. It would have required far more brute force than that to break that bone. As to whether or not he was smuggled out and perhaps alive and maybe living somewhere else, I can't quite bring myself to believe that. But I am absolutely certain that Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. I'm absolutely certain about that. It served the interests of too many powerful people, rich and powerful people, for Epstein not to make it to trial. That the motive for dispensing with him was so powerful, the circumstances of the suicide so remarkable, ridiculously remarkable, that I will never, ever believe it. Jonell, thanks for that call down in Miami. Now, Paul Oquist, Minister Paul Oquist, unfortunately is on the telephone rather than the Skype, but I'm nonetheless glad to welcome him onto the mother of all talk shows. Minister, thank you finally for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, you're known as the Gringo Minister. Why?
Because I was born and raised in the United States, and I was nationalized in Nicaragua in 1981, and I renounced the U.S. citizenship in 1983 when there was the first of three heavy moments in which a U.S. invasion seemed imminent. And as a Sandinista government official at that time, not yet minister, but as a militant of the FSLN and as a Sandinista militiaman, I would defend the revolution. So it's very nasty to have two nationalities at the same time, simultaneously, in two countries at war. So that solved the problem.
Well, it's a very noble step. It's definitely one I would have taken myself, but congratulations to you for
we're kindred souls, George. We're kindred souls.
We are, and we're appearing together on a round table quite soon. I'll get the details of that and let everyone know about it. So now you're a minister in the presidency.
That's correct.
How does that feel right now when the United States is reverting to type? All the dirty tricks that were played against the Sandinista government first time around are now being played again.
Well, this history goes all the way back to the 1850s, as you know, and includes the assassination of Sandino after he had had dinner with President Sacasa, with whom he'd reached a peace deal, by the National Guard. And the National Guard was headed by Somoza, who was the last Marine left behind, and Arthur Lane Bliss, the U.S. ambassador, was directly involved in that. But then if we go back to the 1980s, the CIA was directly planting mines in the port of Corinto. It was attacking naval stations in Potosí, Corinto, Puerto Sandino, and San Juan del Sur and San Juan del Norte. And it was arming, it was financing, it was directing the Contra that were attacking us from Honduras and Costa Rica. So we're kind of used to it, as a matter of fact. It's been going on all the time. There's never been a moment in Nicaraguan history in which the United States was not trying to dominate Nicaragua, and in which, unfortunately, there was not a segment of the Nicaraguan population, namely the oligarchy, that was willing to play that game and support that. While at the same time, there was always also a patriotic element that was resisting that, going back to the fight against William Walker, General Celedon, who resisted the U.S. Marines invading in 1912 to protect U.S. economic interests, going back to Sandino's struggle against the Marine intervention from 1927 to 1934, the Somoza dictatorship and the people who resisted that, and then the great popular victory of the 19th of July in 1979, which, as you can appreciate from the foregoing, was quite a historic moment, a tremendous historic moment.
What is extraordinary is that the United States, having successfully destroyed the Nicaraguan revolution, that you managed to come back, that you managed to win again, and are now some years into your second time around, as it were. How does it feel comparatively this time to the last?
Well, actually, there was very clearly different phases in the Sandinista Popular Revolution. The first phase was pre-1979, the struggle against the Somoza dictatorship, supported 100% to the very last minute by the United States. And then the second phase was the United States supporting ex-guardsmen and others to form a counter-revolutionary force, and the CIA also directly attacking Nicaragua, as the International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled in the 27th of June of 1987 that the United States was responsible for all of those attacks.
It was terrorism. They found them guilty of acts of terrorism in mining the port of Corinto.
That's correct, and not informing about the presence of the mines. A Dutch sailor died as a result of his ship hitting one of those mines. They also attacked the airport, which was terrorism as well. So you had then the terrorism of the Contra in the countryside, which wreaked havoc with rape and pillage in the countryside of Nicaragua, backed by the CIA. And then, of course, the fact that the war was financed after the U.S. Congress, led by Senators Kerry and Kennedy, cut off the official financing for the Contra. The Reagan administration broke not only international law, but also U.S. law by resorting to the import of cocaine in the CIA planes, from where they were shipped to Los Angeles, where a young entrepreneur turned them into cocaine that inundated the ghettos and barrios in the 1980s with tremendous profit that was funneled back to the Contra. The Iran-Contra, George, was a spin. It was a spin that the Reagan and Bush administrations could survive, whereas the real underlying scandal was the CIA cocaine crisis, the CIA introducing cocaine into the United States and poisoning millions of Americans so as to gain finance for their illegal war in Nicaragua.
You're right, a much bigger crime even than the crime of secretly, illegally dealing with the Iranians and giving that money to the Contra. That was
just a few transactions. The cocaine was going on all the time.
Yeah, and it's going on until now. I mean, the mass addiction of people in Los Angeles, in the United States, right down the West Coast, is directly attributable to the CIA selling cocaine to their own people to get money to give to the people that were trying to destroy your revolution.
They could never defeat us militarily. But the financial blockade, the commercial embargo, the working day and night to finance the war, at the end, just to show you how austere, the austerity which the Nicaraguan people suffered, I think it would be comparable to some other countries in World War II. All the unions were asking for their salary was sugar, rice and beans, nothing else, nothing else. No money, because the inflation was running at 30,000% a year. So what they wanted was sugar, rice, and beans, and that was it. And cooking oil also. So that was it. Now, in the 90s and early 2000s, the Frente Sandinista, after it was defeated in the election, had a loyal constitutional opposition to the three liberal governments, which were characterized by being corrupt in the privatization of the public sector. It was corrupt and out thievery in one government. And then there was an extremely weak government. And the FSLN was always as a loyal constitutional opposition, even though each and every election in Nicaragua, the U.S. has always participated directly, directing the opposition against the FSLN. And it's quite a joke to hear the outrage in the United States that some foreign power might have been involved in a U.S. election, when the U.S. has been involved in every Nicaraguan election that's ever been held. The FSLN is the father of democracy in Nicaragua. The first open and clear election was 1984. The first election in the history of Nicaragua in which one force turned power over to the other force as a result of election was 1990. And then the FSLN fought against the CIA's intervention in its elections in 2006, 2011, an election that was stolen from us, and then in 2006 and 2003, and then there was the election in 2001, and then the election in 2006 we finally won with 38% of the vote. But in this fourth phase, in which we've been able to reap the benefits of all the seeds that have been sowed with so many heroes and martyrs, with so much blood, with so much sacrifice involved, we're finally in the phase of being able to give the Nicaraguan people all of the welfare and safety that they deserve. So in this period, poverty has been reduced, and many people have been capitalized. There's been redistributive policies. There's been the restitution of rights of the people, and there's been investment in infrastructure that is to the benefit of all. So, for example, extreme poverty went from 17% to 6.9% in this period. So this last period, and some people don't understand that the revolution is very much alive, and what it's doing now is giving to the Nicaraguan people all of the benefits, all of the redistributive benefits, and the capitalization of the poor, like sub-zero hunger and zero usury, that are transforming the country in these years. But success doesn't mean that the people in Washington or in Miami admire that. That is something that they want to destroy, as a matter of fact, because they do not want to see a successful left-wing government in Latin America.
Well, the threat of a good example, it seems you remain. Dr. Paul Oquist, Minister for National Policies of the Presidency of Nicaragua. I look forward to our roundtable. Details coming up for the audience later. I look forward to seeing you again that night. But I've got to go to the news with Jamie Lowe.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Tune in every Tuesday to Loud and Clear for a regular segment called False Prophets, a weekly look at Wall Street and corporate capitalism, where we talk about the big economic issues of the week from the point of view of working people, the poor, and the U.S. position in the global economy. Join us this Tuesday and every Tuesday with financial policy analyst Daniel Sankey right here on Radio Sputnik.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
At least 33 US states have now experienced an increase in new coronavirus cases compared to last week. A total of 61,352 new cases were recorded and 685 new virus-related deaths. A total of 3,245,925 cases of coronavirus have been recorded in the United States by the end of the day on Saturday, according to Johns Hopkins University. Since the pandemic began, at least 134,777 people have died in the US from the virus. Donald Trump has been seen wearing a face mask in public for the first time, despite previously appearing reluctant to endorse their use. The US president was visiting a military hospital in Washington, where he met injured service personnel and health workers caring for COVID-19 patients. But despite health officials recommending face coverings as a way of limiting the spread of coronavirus, Trump has previously refused to wear them at public events. The Associated Press quoted sources close to the president as saying he feared wearing a mask would make him look weak and that it would shift the focus away from the economic recovery. He has also retweeted messages making fun of his Democratic presidential rival, Joe Biden, for wearing a face mask. A COVID-19 vaccine could be rolled out across the country in the first half of next year if trials are successful, according to a leading UK scientist. Professor Robin Shattock, who heads a team developing a coronavirus vaccine at Imperial College London, has said enough doses would be available for everyone in Britain if trials go really well. Speaking today, he said, "We anticipate, if everything goes really well, we'll get an answer as to whether it works by early next year. So far, 15 volunteers have been vaccinated, but Professor Shattock says this will be ramped up in the coming weeks to include another 200 to 300 patients. But he warned that there was no certainty that any of the vaccines currently being developed would work. Walt Disney World Resort has begun to reopen in Florida despite a coronavirus surge across the US state. The site's Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom opened on Saturday. Epcot and Disney's Hollywood Studios are expected to follow from the 15th of July. Visitors will be required to wear face masks and adhere to other safety measures across the complex in Orlando. More than 250,000 cases of COVID-19 have been reported in Florida, along with 4,197 deaths. Disney first closed the resort in March during the early months of America's outbreak, while infections were largely concentrated in New York and California at first. Florida is amongst several states recording a rise in coronavirus cases in recent weeks. In Orange County, where the resort is based, authorities have reported 16,630 cases, some of the highest numbers in Florida. Some of its competitors, Universal Orlando and SeaWorld Orlando, reopened to visitors several weeks ago. The former US Special Counsel Robert Mueller, in a very rare move, has defended his office's prosecution of Trump advisor Roger Stone, saying he is still a convicted felon, and rightly so, in light of the president's commutation of Stone's jail sentence. He said he lied about the identity of his intermediary to WikiLeaks. He lied about the existence of written communications with his intermediary. He lied by denying he had communicated with the Trump campaign about the timing of WikiLeaks releases. He, in fact, updated senior campaign officials repeatedly about WikiLeaks, and he tampered with a witness, imploring him to stonewall Congress. He added, because his sentence has been commuted, he will not go to prison, but his conviction stands. Trump on Friday commuted the prison sentence of his longtime friend. The announcement came just days before Stone was set to report to a federal prison in Georgia. Poles are voting in a presidential election seen as the battle for the country's future and its strained relations with the European Union. The second round pits incumbent Andrzej Duda, an ally of the Conservative government, against socially liberal Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski. A Duda win would herald controversial changes to the judiciary and continued opposition to abortion and gay rights. Trzaskowski backs a more progressive agenda and an active role in the EU. Duda toppled the first round of voting with a convincing lead, but fell short of the 50% needed to win outright. But Trzaskowski expects to win the support of most of those who voted for other candidates, and a close result is predicted. And finally, a new painting by Sanyu, who's been hailed as the Chinese Matisse, has sold for over 258 million Hong Kong dollars. That's more than 20 million pounds. Sold for that incredible price at auction last week, confirming his status as one of the most sought-after names in the lucrative Asian art market. Painted in the 1950s, Cotonou features 4 reclining female figures in the French-Chinese painter's distinctively saturated style. The artwork led Sotheby's first major sale in Hong Kong since the coronavirus disrupted its live auction schedule, becoming the evening's most expensive lot after a 10-minute bidding war between 4 collectors. It's just the latest astronomical price paid for a work by Sanyu, who went largely unrecognised during his lifetime and was effectively destitute upon his death in Paris in 1966. Skyrocketing prices reflect a surge in interest from Asian collectors, whose spending power now significantly shapes the global auction market. Between the year 2000 and 2019, the price of Sanyu's work jumped by more than 1,000%. According to experts, his brushstrokes and a sense of proportion are truly Matissean. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, I'm speaking on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock on Scotland, the SNP, the forthcoming Scottish Parliament elections next May, the launch of Alliance for Unity, with which I'm involved. You can follow that on Twitter, Alliance #4 Unity. And I'll be speaking about all matters connected to the Scottish independence question and the SNP on Tuesday at 8 o'clock. But if Paul would call me up, he'd make my night. Now, I'm also doing that round table that I told you about with Minister Dr. Paul Oquist on the 41st anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, and his focus now of how imperialism is destroying the planet. So the round table is on the 16th of July. The 16th of July, but it will be replayed, rebroadcast on the 19th. I still don't have the time that is on. If that could be got for me, I'd appreciate it. Now, the doctor will see you now. Dr. Ranjeet Brar is the Moats medic. He is the closest thing that the world has ever seen to Dr. Kildare. He is a voice of such clarity and interest that he's become an internet sensation. And I'm glad to say we had a hand in that. Dr. Ranjeet Brar, thank you for joining us. Let's talk about the United States first, if we may. It appears to be literally out of control now in the United States. The numbers are rising exponentially in the hottest states. Remember, Donald Trump said that when the heat came in the spring, the virus would die. But in the hottest places in the United States, places like Texas, Arizona, Florida, it is cutting an incredible swathe through the population. In Florida yesterday, there were 12,500 new cases in one day. Why is it so out of control there, Doctor?
Thanks, George. Pleasure to be back with you again. As you say, this virus is very far from over in the world. We've seen, again, a massive increase since we spoke last week. So there are now 13 million cases in the world. And the United States has quite consistently had around a quarter, between a third and a quarter of those figures in terms of numbers of cases. And the United States has currently 140,000 deaths from coronavirus. But as you say, they've re-entered a sharp exponential phase of rise. Trump himself was seen for the first time wearing a mask, finally seeming to comprehend the necessity of urgent measures to be taken. But we've talked several times about the peculiar factors. You predicted before I did, George, that you thought United States would quite possibly have the worst record and be the worst country. Right from the very inception, we saw the fact that initially it was impossible to get testing in the United States at a price that the population could afford. The United States is the richest country on earth, but as we've said before, it's the most unequal country on earth, where the 3 richest people have the same amount of wealth as the poorest 200 million. And that means a vast number of people with their private healthcare system, which is led by insurance companies which take great pride in the fact that they are able to increase the dividend to companies by reducing the overall spend on healthcare. So more than 1/3, between 30 and 40% of the total spending of the population on healthcare goes to companies' profits and dividends rather than on health. There are 60 to 70 million people. We don't know the true figures because as more and more people become unemployed, very often their Medicare, their healthcare benefits and insurance are linked to their employment. And we've seen an increase of some 50 million people becoming unemployed in the United States, in a country where there are already between 50 and 60 million people who had no access to healthcare.
I mean, it's possible now, I was just reading this, that more than 100 million people in the United States today don't have healthcare.
I think that's an entirely reasonable estimate. And, that is getting on for 25 to probably 30% of the population of the richest country on earth cannot access healthcare. Then, of course, you have a system where there's inherent mistrust in information. Now, Trump has himself promoted that quite heavily. He said, this is fake news from the beginning. I think the people widely recognize that we get a lot of misinformation in our media, nowhere more so than the United States, but then they don't have a suitable avenue to trust. And we've seen record amount of propaganda and disinformation around this. I mean, one bizarre press briefing that you'll remember in which Trump essentially said the best results were to be obtained by drinking bleach, and actually people were turning up at the A&E facilities in the United States having drunk bleach, thinking that might help them. So, incredible amount of disinformation, very poor leadership from the top, a federal structure whereby states themselves are outbidding each other for medicines, for PPE, where there was lack of preparedness, lack of preventative measures. And a country where actually there's incredible poverty amidst the apparent wealth. And we know that coronavirus hits the poor first and foremost. And then, of course, we've seen with the increasing unemployment, with the murder of George Floyd, there have been tremendous movements of unrest and discontent with the American political status quo. That's huge numbers of people on the streets. And of course, Trump himself at various points, despite his measures of lockdown, tweeting to his supporters that it's time to retake their city and encouraging demonstrations. So everything that should be done and can be done in an organized society where the population have a decent social security net and have trust in the information that they're receiving, is not being done in the United States, and it's not being done systematically, precisely because actually of their political and economic system and the inequality that it engenders, George.
The organized society that has dealt with this most effectively is, of course, China, which is the reason why the United States political class, or one half of it, the other half is still fixated on Russia, but the Republicans, the right, far right of American politics, has decided that more or less it's war with China.
Yeah, I think on this note, there's a very interesting report came out from Philip Alston, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. You may remember he is a chap who visited Britain during Theresa May's tenure as Prime Minister and commented and made really headlines by pointing out that up to 1/3 of British children were living in extreme poverty, huge numbers of people in work, perhaps a fifth of the British population were were food insecure and needing to visit food banks, that there was a homelessness crisis in Britain that perhaps meant 2% of the population, in fact, were unemployed, though much of it hidden because of sofa surfing and various insecure forms. Now, he actually just retired from his post and he's published his final report, and he has made a very damning statement saying that actually, coronavirus has come to a world in which inequality, poverty, and disrespect for human life are already rampant. He said he's shot a hole in the United Nations themselves, saying that their actual measure for the poverty line, which is $1.90 per day or £1.50 per day, is grossly unambitious and actually itself is not enough in most countries, even the poorest countries on earth where living is cheaper, to secure food and housing. So there are huge problems of poverty and inequality in the world. Coronavirus has made that worse, but actually, he said the one country which had bucked that trend, which actually had, if you see a lot of free market fundamentalists, as they've been liberalizing the world, have said, but look, there's less poverty than ever. He said that's due to two things. One is that measure, which is so low of absolute poverty. So the other is that actually it's China that's lifted, hundreds of millions, actually probably 750 million people out of poverty over the last decade, which bucks the whole trend of the rest of the world. And it's precisely that neoliberal mechanism, and these are Philip Alston's words, which in fact has plunged the world into poverty, which has left it in this dire state. And therefore, it is ironic that the United States should constantly point the finger at China, the one country which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, as being the abuser of human rights. It constantly, of course, tries to destabilize China, and we've seen a ramping up of that propaganda this week onto a perhaps not unprecedented scale, but almost a war footing, with the United Nations also joining and saying to citizens you shouldn't go there because of the new security law, which the Chinese are quite rightly now introducing in order to try and stop a campaign of destabilization which is being waged against China in Hong Kong, amongst other places, George.
Now, lastly, and I'm grateful as always for your time, Doctor, the British situation. There seems to be an element, more than an element, there seems to be chaos in the British government's approach now. First of all, we were all supposed to wear masks in shops. I do anyway. I wear mask and gloves in a shop. Why wouldn't you? You're surrounded by a significant number of people. There's the interests of the workers in the shop that have no choice but to sit there and have people breathe on them. And now Michael Gove, this day, seems to have rowed back from that. Should we be wearing masks or not?
I certainly think that people who are working in situations where they're exposed need to be wearing masks, need to be wearing gloves, and need to have adequate PPE. We've already seen actually a mask and gloves and an aprons in a hospital setting dealing with COVID patients is actually not adequate PPE. In fact, what we've done throughout this crisis in Britain, our government have, rather than be led by the science, they've been led by their lack of preparedness and what they can roll out. So, they've constantly changed whether COVID-19 itself is a high impact disease, which necessitates a certain grade of PPE. They've done away with that because they couldn't provide it, hadn't prepared, despite the fact that they were warned by Operation Cygnus, which Jeremy Hunt had overseen in 2015 when he was Health Secretary. They'd realised that the NHS would fall over in the face of a pandemic, and rather than enact changes, which would have meant going against their systematic policy of running down capacity and privatisation, because they weren't prepared to do that, they simply buried the report. And really, it's been a similar case at every stage. I think the government are quite clearly not going to provide masks and PPE. There's almost a kind of situation of profiteering. There's certainly demand would far outstrip supply currently if you asked everyone to wear it, and therefore this is what's conditioning the equivocal, blowing hot and cold on these questions. There's no question that the number of deaths are gradually falling, but really that's leveled off. This week probably there were 600 deaths, and been falling maybe 100 a week for the last 3-4 weeks. But all the signs are that we're leveling off at this rate, and as we ease off of lockdown, and really it's almost gone. Despite the haphazard measures that are being adopted, really we're very likely to see an increase in the rate. I hope not to the extent that the United States is facing, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I was looking again at the rate of the prevalence to see if my previous facts were correct. It does seem that in London, perhaps as many as 17% of the population have had coronavirus. Much of the country is around 5%. East of England maybe 10, and north of England maybe 11. But essentially, the vast majority of the country still have not had the virus, are susceptible. There are 14,000 people currently who have the virus around the UK, and if we don't take adequate measures to stop it from spreading, we still are very likely, George, to have a second wave without wanting to be alarmist.
Doctor, thank you again for your sagacious tour of the coronavirus horizon. Much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Paul hasn't called, but Joe in Glasgow has. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Joe.
Hi there, George. Pleasure to speak with you again.
And you, sir?
Just wanting to speak about, as you said, about the independence referendum. I'm a bit like yourself, a Labour man in Scotland, opposing to Scottish independence. I look at it the same sort of glasses that you look at through. You know, what's the difference between a man in Glasgow like myself and a man down in Newcastle? We earn the same money, we watch the same TV shows, you know, we read the same newspapers, whatever it may be, sometimes even support the same teams. So there's a lot more in common than as between me and somebody in, say, Brussels. But I just think that the policy that's been taken by the parties in, down in Westminster or in Scotland as well, unconditional opposition to independence is completely fine. But I just think that the unconditional opposition to a referendum isn't really a systematic democracy. I understand that this is that, oh, well, you had your referendum once, but surely even you could see that, oh, well, you know, things have changed, and maybe it would be better for the Labour Party in Scotland to focus on criticising the SNP and their poor record on things than, you know, opposing a referendum.
Well, I think that's a very wise and level-headed intervention. The Scottish people have the right to hold a referendum, subject, of course, to the modalities of it being agreed and a mandate for holding it being achieved. And by which I mean, if Nicola Sturgeon puts in her election manifesto in May, if you elect me, I will hold another referendum on independence, and she wins the power back again, then clearly she has a mandate for another referendum, though not an untrammeled mandate. For example, the issue of the franchise, the issue of the question, the issue of the modalities of that referendum, will have to be far more seriously negotiated than they were with David Cameron. David Cameron gave Alex Salmond absolutely everything that he wanted, including the right to frame the question, so that people like you and me were forced to argue for the word no, which puts you back a couple of points before you've even kicked the ball, Joe. Nobody likes to be the one promoting the negative in a question. So, for example, the question next time will have to be, do you wish to leave Britain or remain in Britain? The same question that we put in the EU referendum. The question of the franchise, I believe, is also very important. The issue of who can vote and who cannot vote. Last time, I had no vote. Next time I will have a vote. But the issue of who can vote is another important question. But the timing issue is debatable. There is no question that Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond both repeatedly, by which I mean dozens of times, on the public record, said inter alia, this is a once-in-a-lifetime referendum or a once-in-a-generation referendum. Now, 6 years is not a lifetime. It's not even the lifetime of a rabbit. And it's not a generation either. A generation is 20 years, perhaps even 25 years, but let's be generous, 20 years, 6 of which have elapsed. So the question of when such a referendum can be held is a moot point. I believe that while the government of Britain, which Scotland voted to remain in, is dealing with the exiting from the European Union, it is absurd to have a referendum. It is absurd to have a referendum in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Or as Nicola Sturgeon herself said just this day on the BBC, while we're coping with the economic devastation created by the coronavirus pandemic. So the timing of it is debatable, is moot. The principle that Scotland can have a referendum when it decides to do so is accepted by me and always has been. Scotland is a nation. It has national rights. It has the right to remain in Britain. It has the right to leave Britain. But it's not a unilateral right, is what I'm saying, Joe. Last word to you.
I appreciate that, George. No, I understood where you come from. I put it very eloquently there. I'm wondering if I could just make one quick point. I know you'll probably have precious time.
No, go on.
You've probably looked at today's date, George, and it's normally very busy around this time of year in a certain place, that place being Belfast. I can't believe it, even in this modern day situation and the coronavirus pandemic, as you see, we're still seeing bonfires in Belfast with things like that very vile thing said about the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-fascist movement and so on. It's ridiculous. I just want you to, your opinion, how we could go about getting the arms order and people that celebrate that sort of thing as a hate group, because that's what it is, George.
Well, all sectarianism is vile and to be deplored. Sectarianism between Christians, sectarianism between Muslims, sectarianism of all kinds is a deplorable thing. And I have always not only stood against it, but sometimes been on the receiving end of it. As a matter of fact, I now get a literally ceaseless stream of abuse, including threats, from the other side of that divide, Joe. I'm no longer family, it would appear. The one thing we cannot allow to happen is for sectarian division to dictate the political future of Scotland. That would be simply monstrous. Someone is not good because they are on one side of that divide, or bad because they're on the other side. All expressions of sectarianism and hate are to be deplored. As it happens, nowadays, I get far more hate from the people that I worked to support over all of my life than I do from the other side. And that's pretty deplorable too. Joe, thanks for the call. Let's go to Julian in London. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello, George. I want to talk about the annexation. And following on from a call you had earlier and a comparison, that must be the annexation of Carlisle, which is a historically Scottish town.
I literally thought that's what you were about to say. Are you talking about the border? There's ghouls across the Scottish border screaming hate at English tourists, devastating the Scottish tourist industry on top of all the other devastation that the Scottish economy has suffered. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for the British taxpayer, Scotland would literally have sunk, economically sunk already.
There's a lot of devastation that's gone on everywhere in the past few months, but I did want to bring up the annexation in the West Bank and the 30% of the territory that the Palestinians are losing. Someone made a laughable comparison earlier, but there is a real annexation going on in contravention of international law. I took my camera out into London, as you know I like to do, and filmed a socially distant protest with one other person, and I saw a few other people doing the same thing, and it caught a little bit online. But I wonder if this is another opportune moment to bury bad news and perform and act like this while the world
I was just about to ask you.
demonstrate.
I was about to ask you if I'd missed it because there was intense speculation. Not even last week. I think the week before that this was about to happen, but it hasn't actually yet happened, has it?
So we're teetering on the edge of it, and it seems like it could happen any moment now. And
not that it would make any difference to the people who live there, of course, because they've been living there entirely under the rule of their occupier for 53 years.
And the one surprising difference that it won't make is that the people living there will not gain citizenship. Now, if they did, it might be fair, and you might say, why not just annex the whole of Palestine, Israel-Palestine, and call it Israel-Palestine?
And give everybody the vote. That's my policy, yeah.
They want the land and not the people. That's the definition of apartheid and racism.
Thank you, Julian, indeed for that. We'll, of course, cover it if indeed it happens. A Facebook user says these elites have been doing these kinds of sick acts for a long time. The power and money can buy their freedom from justice. Let's pray this sickness is exposed and their world is toppled. And John says, watching from COVID-free New Zealand. Tip my hat to New Zealand. What a wonderful job they did. Richard says, unfortunately, they won't have George on national TV. He'd wake up all the sheeple that are still asleep. He should still be in Parliament. Thank you, Richard. But I'm doing better than national TV. I'm on international TV with you now, and turning in a bigger audience than any British political television program. And on YouTube, Mary says, Bill Gates and Epstein devised a maniacal plan to weed out so-called undesirables and repopulate the planet with what they viewed as their exclusive club's superior genes. And on YouTube, Bunny says, I love Trump, the best US president in living memory. And Keel says, George, Paul can't call. He's been admitted. I better not say the next words in the light of Manila's plea to us to be kinder on issues of mental health. Haywood says it's out of control in the US because our government did nothing when it had the chance. And then when it did, the fascists came out in the street and threatened violence over the lockdown. And another writer says, Trump said America would be safe from virus by Easter. He meant next year. And Kiki says the numbers are going to continue to rise in America because America is not doing what it was supposed to do in the eyes of God. And Jazz says the most undemocratic country with half the population without health care, university debts and all their taxes going to another country. And Nicotina says if Trump kills off his voters by lying about COVID-19, who will vote for him? And Tom says that Dr. Brar is a top man and knows his business. Indeed, he does. Quick break and then calls. Here's the number again, 02077 982 255 if you're in the UK. If you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480.
Hello, people of Britain. It's your Prime Minister here, Boris Johnson. Oh, yeah. Sorry, well, I've got to take a call. Yo, Dominic! No, I'm not busy. What's up? Oh, what do you mean you're in Durham? Well, you shouldn't be up there. You should be in bloody London, for God's sake. Get yourself back to work, man. And you're sure you weren't spotted? With your eyesight? Well, if you wanted a castle, man, you should have just said I could have got you one. You know, just get yourself back to work. Yep. I love you too. Okay, bye. Well, hope nobody heard that. Now, you're listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway, where there are no tuition fees. We'll see about that, George.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Yeah. Now, karma is a terrible thing. I was going to use a word I'm not really supposed to use anymore. But President Bolsonaro of Brazil, who was one of these COVID idiots who denied the whole thing was all a hoax, now has the coronavirus. And we've got a call from Sao Paulo. Samwell, who is an infectious disease specialist. Samwell, welcome.
Hi, George. Thanks for having my call. The reason I'm calling is to make an appeal, because I think in this urgency of confronting the three stooges, Trump, Boris Johnson, and Bolsonaro, I think the left is getting almost everything wrong about this pandemic. I think we have slight filtering the information through the mouths of Bolsonaro and Trump, and it's compromising our ability to understand it and to actually follow the science. Bolsonaro is a jerk. He's genocidal guy, okay. But since he said that it's just a small flu, now we know the lethality of coronavirus is similar to flu. Actually is. And if you're under 45, it's almost zero. There's no reason for us to keep, for example, the schools closed. Here in Sao Paulo, they reopened the bars, the restaurants, but the schools are still closed. I think, and it has implications for our response. Now we are living not just a pandemic, but the historical record of transfer of public resources to private hands, and with the left defending lockdowns, this is the thing, there's no science backing this. I will appeal to you because you have a great audience, but most internet shows the left is getting everything wrong. The generalized using of masks is not useful. And we have the left repeating the propaganda of these lockdowns and masks and everything. I'll give you an example. This great surge in cases in the U.S., Trump said it's because of the testing. Everybody makes fun of him. In this specific point, for example, it's true. If you look at the graphic, basically this surge is for notifications of new cases, but discovered in serological tests, which means you could have had COVID 2 months ago, and if you test today, you've got positive antibodies, and this is being counted.
What about all the dead Americans and Brazilians?
It does kill, but it does kill mostly vulnerable people.
Is that okay then?
No, you can't. It's just like flu, for example. Flu.
No, it's three times. It is 3 times more lethal than flu. Yes.
No, it's not.
No, I'll let you speak for quite a long time without interrupting you. You came on here to say you're an opponent of Bolsonaro, Trump, and Boris Johnson, but you actually support the political approach to the coronavirus of Bolsonaro and Donald Trump. And you are in denial about the level of lethality. It is exactly, if you want the exact percentage, it is 2.9 times more lethal than flu. That is virtually 3 times more lethal than flu. And hundreds of thousands of people are dead. And it's of no comfort to me whatsoever that they were vulnerable. As a matter of fact, that makes it worse, not better. Off with you. Fabrice is in the south of France. Let's hear from him. Fabrice.
Hi, George. Good evening.
Evening.
great to be calling back again.
We're all over the world tonight. It's wonderful. Go ahead.
I'm about 100 kilometers to the north of Spain, in the south of France to the north of Spain, not far from Andorra.
Okay.
So my question is, I'd like to know your opinion, hear your opinion, on someone I know in England who sort of seems to fall into into the traps of what the mainstream media would like us to believe to be true, which then on alternative media, your show, RT, amongst many others, the Duran, for example, .com, we get much more of an insightful and intelligent and what I can actually follow as making sense arguments. And my question is regarding BBC, whether it's bias or not. And I'm in contact with someone in England on a fairly regular basis who, as I said, falls into the traps of believing what she is supposed to believe. She argues that BBC is independent because it's paid for by a license, not by the government, paid for by a license. Whereas, for example, the mainstream media in the USA, CNN, MSNBC, corporate-owned, so we can understand that. They're corporate-owned. Or we have ITV in England, the UK, we have ITV, Channel 4, certainly ITV paid for by advertising. And then we have RT, which is state-funded, paid for by the government, which is to a large extent true. That doesn't, however, write off the good quality work that can be produced. But believing that BBC is somehow independent, it's a difficult one for me to counter argue.
Well, let me give you the facts, Fabrice. If the license fee is set by the government, then the BBC must never fall foul of the government that sets the level of its license fee.
Well, they could set it higher or lower, couldn't they? They could change it.
Well,
they could make it more,
of course, the appetite of the BBC for public money is literally insatiable, and is billions of pounds, something like £5 billion a year.
Coming from the license, is that right?
Yes, but this was my second point. First of all, the government sets the level of the license fee. The government, through the legal system, punishes people, including by imprisonment, if they fail to pay it. If I were to tell you, for example, that the greatest number of women prisoners in Britain's jails are there because of failure to pay the license fee.
Is that really true?
Yes,
That's incredible.
It's the biggest single reason for incarceration of women in the British penal system. And the government runs the justice system and makes it illegal for you not to pay. Thirdly, the Director General of the BBC is picked by the government, or rather by the Board of Governors, who are picked by the government. The chairman of the governors is a hand-picked government appointee. Until recently, and I've no reason to believe that it's changed, the British intelligence services literally have an office inside the BBC, casting their evil eye on the political views of the employees. But largely, none of these things are necessary. The employees of the BBC know which way the wind is blowing. They know that someone like me is to be treated as an enemy of the state. They know that someone like Tony Blair is to be treated as if he were the Oracle, and so on. They don't need anyone to threaten them or punish them.
They do it willingly.
Willingly. There's an old adage, Fabrice: thank God you cannot bribe or twist the average British journalist. But when you see what unbribed he'll do, you realize there's no reason to.
Need to. They do it anyway.
They do it anyway.
It's a difficult one to I suspect anyway. I'm a suspicious type of person, so I don't trust them anyway until they have earned. I feel that they have earned their trust.
Well, they entirely lost trust in the last 20 years.
I don't trust them. One example, a journalist said, I think it was on the Grey Zone, said recently they had something like, just to throw the numbers up roughly, more or less in the air, 300 articles on Venezuela, and all were negative except one. So 1 out of 300.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I haven't even looked at their website. I wouldn't be found dead on their website, but I'm not remotely surprised by that. The BBC once had a reputation, undeserved, but a reputation for relative impartiality.
Yes.
But ever since the run-up to the Iraq War, it has been the Bush and Blair Corporation for me.
Terrible. I say to myself, they make good nature programs. We can be sure of that.
They do, but other people could make them. And we now live in an era where nobody even watches television regularly.
I haven't had a television for 30 years, I would say.
Well,
and I don't know how this person that I communicate with on a regular basis in England can wade through the Times newspaper, the Channel 4 News, and the BBC. Really, it's something in me when I listen to them. I feel that I'm not being told the truth.
Well, that's right. There are still millions of people who are sheeple,
still watching,
and who swallow the line that the prevailing orthodoxy wants them to swallow. But it's fewer people now, Fabrice, than ever before.
Your show, for example, so you're saying you get a higher audience than, let's say, for example, BBC or Channel 4, you get a higher number.
Vastly more.
That's incredible.
Vastly more. This show was watched last week, by 750,000 people. 751,000.
They must know that the people, the media, the mainstream, let's call them the mainstream media, which is the dinosaur, blah, blah, whatever, they must know this.
They do know it. That's why they would never refer to the existence of this show. They will never report the fact that this show is being seen by many multiples of people compared to any of the BBC, ITV, Channel 4 political shows.
So
many multiples.
Why don't they get their act together and improve the quality of what they give us, and then at least they could have a chance of competing?
Well, a scorpion stings because it's a scorpion.
Right.
They do what they do because of what they are and what their purpose is. I just wanted to make the point. This show was watched last week by 751,000 people, but it was also listened to on FM in Washington, D.C., on AM from coast to coast in the United States, and online on SputnikNews.com across the whole world. So you've got to add the listeners to the 751,000 viewers. And that means, I can't tell you the number of listeners, it's not countable. But it's inconceivable to me that it wouldn't put the total audience last week at 1 million. Now you tell me a show, never mind a left-wing show, that gets 1 million viewers. A 3-hour show every week. This is successful because...
And people also, they tune in, they listen, they watch because they want to, because they choose to.
It doesn't cost them anything, but they are here because they've chosen to. And one of the reasons why they've chosen to is that they have lost faith in the so-called mainstream broadcasters. They no longer, just like you, feel that they're being told the truth by these mainstream broadcasters. They may well surf around and take in other people, maybe people with diametrically different political views, but that's fine. We exist and we are thriving because we give a point of view, but we allow any other point of view its fair share of the microphone. And that doesn't happen in the mainstream media. Fabrice, I have not been on the BBC for a period of at least 4 years. 4 years. And I'm one of the most well-known political figures in the country.
And I've seen it on a YouTube video, Pac-Man interviewing you. And this awful technique, a real bullying kind of technique that just turns most sensitive kind of people off. You had just won. I think it was somewhere in London.
Well, but believe me, Fabrice.
Are you glad to do blah, 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 blah? There's a real bullying technique.
But believe me, Fabrice, compared to Jeremy Paxman, the new generation are far, far, far worse. they're Paxman without the brains. Look, thanks. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I almost felt I was in the south of France, which is the closest I'm going to get to that this year, I think. Let's talk with Joshua in London. Go ahead, Joshua.
You all right there, George?
Yes, good, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, George, obviously, I mean, the Scottish government feel, or at least a lot of nationalists feel, that they should weaponise COVID, and the Scottish government's comparatively better handling of it than the UK government as a pretext for independence. But well, just a bit of inspiration, you might call it. You know, like when you take other countries across the world, like Japan, for example, that has, you know, a quarter of the number of infections that Scotland, COVID-19 related deaths that Scotland has. The fact that it's, even though its population is 25 times larger than Scotland, I do think that it does call into question on a global, in a global context.
Scotland has the fourth worst death rate in the world. So
I know. You know, but they're only the nationalists are only going to ever do it in relation to the UK government.
They like to paint their handling of the epidemic as a success story, but that's a lie. Their covering up of the Nike conference and the outbreak that took place there, their shunting of old people into care homes, careless of whether or not they were infected, has led to excessive deaths and entirely unnecessary deaths. And the weaponizing of COVID that you refer to is a real thing. Just this weekend, as last weekend, there are people done up like Chernobyl technicians, screaming hate at English people to get the F out of Scotland on the basis that somehow the English are carrying a plague into Scotland. They would rather that we left the furlough money on which 1 million Scots are currently living, that we just left it at the border and didn't bother crossing. Joshua, thanks for that call. Gerald is in Kilwinning, in Ayrshire. Let's hear from him. Gerald, go ahead.
Hello, George. I said I was from Kilwinning. I'm not sure if your man knew where that was in Scotland, but I knew you'd be there. You've probably been there on your travels many years ago.
Our editor lives very close to you. And I better not say which village, but very, very close to you. So I don't know why they said Glasgow on the screen. It's definitely not Glasgow.
I just say that so they know where I'm going.
All right.
Well, I'm sure your editor had a very good July the 12th celebration. I'm sure you did, George. One of the greatest days in the history of the Catholic Church, when I'm sure you remember a Pope supported King William of Orange to a great Catholic victory, something celebrated in Northern Ireland for many years.
Yes, go ahead, Joe.
Just, my point is really about, it's the Premiership games. I know it's not probably the most important subject, but every game now is the taking of the knee. And I kind of feel like
I think it's begun to stop, Gerald. I didn't see it today.
No, it did happen, George. What happened was they had a minute's silence for Jack Charlton, and they had literally 5 seconds of taking the knee after it.
Okay.
I just kind of feel like it started off with it's a great concept, but now it's like it's become corporatized. It's almost like the BBC and the Premier League. They're giving themselves a pat on the back by doing this. I think the message has been lost.
I thought it was dying out. It's probably time for it to die out. The point has been made. Black lives do matter, and footballers, a very substantial proportion of whom are, of course, themselves black. More than a third of English Premiership players are black. They themselves have suffered racism, abuse from the terraces, and so on. And it was right that they played their part in it. But it's probably becoming a bit hackneyed, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I just think to myself, when I see all these players doing it, and I'm not slagging them off, but I look at even some of the young white players. If you were to throw a name out of there, like, say, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, would they actually know who they were? And this is my own ignorance. I couldn't actually tell you. I know more about the American racial pioneers, like, you know, those men I've mentioned, than I do. I couldn't tell you the name of any of the black English racial, pioneers who helped. You know,
well, maybe we should address that actually in a subsequent program. Gerald, thanks for that. I've got to give Mike in South Carolina just 1 minute to make his point. Mike, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, George. Great to talk to you again. Never miss your show.
Thanks.
A quick question here or two about the Scottish independence thing. We were talking about the time frame. You said that was 6 years ago that they voted. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, but it was 4 years ago that they voted that the UK voted to leave the European Union.
Yes.
It was 2016 when that happened.
Mike,
okay?
I've literally got 20 seconds, so let me give you an answer. The Scottish referendum was explicitly supposed to be a once-in-a-generation referendum. A generation is not 6 years. We voted to remain in Britain, and Britain voted to leave the European Union. It's really not rocket science. It's logic. See you next week.